All right. Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to wander a little, because tonight's story begins exactly where our species always did. On two tired feet. This is the walking ape. Why we still move like hunters. Why walking heals us. A quiet journey into the science, memory, and deep time habits our bodies never forgot. Welcome to Sleepless Homo. Soft science, slow storytelling, and late-night archaeology for curious minds. I'm not here to excite you. I'm here to walk beside you, a fellow human trying to understand why we still move the way ancient hunters once did. Now imagine this. A small primate standing on the edge of a world it no longer fully understood. The trees behind it thinning, the grasses ahead rising like a pale green sea. For millions of years its ancestors had lived in the shifting mosaic of ancient Africa, moving through canopies that felt safe and familiar. But sometime between 6 million and 3 million years ago, something in that landscape changed just enough to ask a quiet question. What if you tried lifting your weight onto 2 legs instead of 4? And what if that strange, wobbling experiment opened the door to everything that would follow? The story of standing upright is not a tale of triumph. It is a tale of compromise, of awkwardness, of anatomy adjusting one bone at a time to a world that kept transforming around it. Forests retreated and expanded with each pulse of climate. Rainfall patterns drifted. Rivers carved new paths. What had been dense woodland in one generation could become scattered woodland in the next, and then stretch into open grassland within another small eternity. There was no moment when an ape declared itself a walker. Instead, there was only adaptation pushed by subtle pressures. Trees that grew further apart, foods that appeared on the ground more often than in branches, predators that learned new ambush strategies in the grass. And so an ancestral body began to shift. When we picture these earliest walkers, it is tempting to imagine something already human. But what the fossils show us is far stranger. Creatures like Orrorin in the early half of this period still carried the curved fingers of a climber, the strong arms of an animal that trusted branches more than soil. Yet inside the thigh bone of Orrorin lies a quiet clue. Bone thickening on one side, the same pattern we see in bipedal load-bearing today. Not a full-time walker, but an ape experimenting with upright stance more often than others of its kind, and nearby, in sites where the sediments tell stories of mixed environments, we find the same signals repeated partial adaptations, hints, the world nudging the body without forcing it. As climate continued its slow breathing, another lineage appeared. Ardipithecus, living around one step further along the path, Ardi was neither a knuckle walker nor a comfortable biped, but something in between. Its pelvis is one of the great puzzles of paleoanthropology. It is short and broad enough to suggest habitual upright posture, but still long and flexible enough to allow climbing with ease. Each piece resembles a negotiation between two worlds. The forests of Ardi's Ethiopia were not endless, and even climbing specialists needed ways to move efficiently across the ground between patches of woodland. Standing upright was not superior. It was simply useful. Anatomy shifts long before awareness does. Long before anyone inside these bodies understood the implications, their hip bones had begun to reshape. The ilia of the pelvis flattened and rotated to the side, creating new surfaces for muscles that would stabilize the torso over a single supporting limb. Without this change, any attempt to walk upright would have produced a swaying, collapsing frame. Nature solved this by sculpting the pelvis into something like a bowl, allowing muscles to tug laterally and keep the body balanced during weight transfer. This change would later become essential for everything humans do on foot, But at this early stage it was merely a quiet correction, a way to prevent falling. By the time the Australopithecines walked onto the scene, between 4 million and 3 million years ago, something unmistakably directional had taken shape. These beings carried torsos still somewhat top-heavy, but their lower bodies reveal a story etched in bone: the wide, flaring pelvis, the angled femur drawing the knee inward so that each step brought the foot directly beneath the centre of mass, the familiar S-shaped curve in the lower spine that allows energy to transfer more efficiently with each stride. No single trait defines bipedalism, but together they form a pattern that cannot be mistaken. These creatures walked upright far more often than they climbed. We sometimes imagine evolution as a straight path toward improvement, but the earliest walkers were not designed for our style of locomotion. They wobbled, they compensated. Their feet were almost midway between grasping and grounded. Some still had opposable big toes capable of curling around branches. Others had begun fusing the midfoot into a rigid platform better suited to transferring force during upright stance. Even within a single species the transition was uneven. The earth was full of half-adapted forms, each trying to solve its own relationship with the land beneath it. If there is wonder in this period, it lies in how experimental everything was. Dozens of potential solutions branching out, only some of which would eventually lead to us. The world around them was no less experimental. From 6 million years ago onward, the African environment entered cycles of drying and cooling, punctuated by intervals of forest expansion that must have seemed like brief climatic reprieves. These shifts did not arrive as sudden catastrophes, but as long, slow rearrangements. A river shifting course could create new floodplains. A decade of drought could push fruiting trees into decline. Grasses spread across areas that once offered easy climbing routes. Predators evolved their own strategies for these new habitats. In times of uncertainty, bodies that could switch between climbing and upright walking had an advantage, not through superiority but through flexibility. A creature that could stand to scan for dangers or reach fruits from low branches simply grew more adaptable in landscapes that offered fewer guarantees. This is the context in which early bipedal footprints appear, like the famous trails found in ancient volcanic ash. These impressions do more than confirm upright stance. They reveal subtle mechanics, the roll of the foot from heel to midfoot, the pressure through the big toe, the narrow track that reflects legs angled inward, and they tell us that these beings walked together. The environmental details surrounding those prints suggest a group crossing an open area, neither rushed nor scrambling, simply moving toward what the day demanded. Footprints carry a kind of memory of presence, and in them we glimpse the simplicity of those early walks. No mission, no technology, just a body learning what the ground felt like beneath it. What remains humbling about this story is how little control our ancestors had over it. They did not choose bipedalism. The landscape chose for them changes in vegetation distribution, changes in the availability of safe foraging zones, and changes in predator behavior created pressures that favored upright posture. But every solution brought challenges. Standing on two legs made childbirth more complicated, eventually altering pelvic morphology in ways that would echo through all later hominin evolution. It increased exposure to predators when crossing open land. It strained joints and lower backs in ways quadrupedal ancestors never experienced. Yet even with these costs, the advantages of scanning over tall grass, of freeing the upper limbs for balancing, and of navigating mixed terrain kept this adaptation spreading through the population, generation after generation. One of the quiet truths of deep time is that evolution solves problems slowly, often without elegance at first. The earliest walkers likely had awkward gaits, transitional foot structures, and spinal curves still settling into their new loads, their inhabited bodies still negotiating with gravity, trying to reconcile arboreal ancestry with terrestrial necessity. And yet, across those long millennia, the pattern held upholding weight on two limbs became normal. Moving across open land became familiar. Standing became identity long before it became destiny. If there is a question lingering at the end of this transformation, it is this: why did this posture persist and not revert when climate cycled back to more forested conditions? Part of the answer may lie in the irreversibility of certain anatomical changes. Once hips widen, once femurs angle inward, once spinal curves deepen, a lineage becomes committed in subtle ways. A return to full arboreality would have been possible only through new adaptations, and evolution rarely goes backward unless the environment demands it. The land no longer did. By the middle of this period, upright posture had embedded itself in the body plan of hominins so thoroughly that every future branch of our family tree inherited it, including those that would later leave Africa entirely. Another part of the answer lies in how standing changed perception. An upright creature sees the world differently. The horizon shifts. The angle of danger shifts. The relationship between self and environment changes. With height comes awareness. Awareness of distances, landmarks, food sources, weather signals. These shifts do not immediately produce intelligence, but they expand the sensory canvas on which cognition can grow. Even simple bipedal animals gain new vantage points. Our ancestors lived that truth without understanding it. By lifting their heads above the grass, they stepped into a new kind of world, where information travelled differently, and the body learned to respond to that information in new ways. Today, we tend to treat bipedalism as a human feature, but the truth is gentler. It was a response to ancient landscapes, not a blueprint for future greatness. It was a solution born from environmental drift, a survival strategy etched into bones slowly and imperfectly. And yet that simple shift, one foot placed before another, would ripple outward into every later chapter of human story. For now, though, it was just a way to move through the world more efficiently, a way to see a little farther, a way to adapt to a home that kept changing its shape. If you follow those early walkers in your mind, across those scattered woodland edges and onto the soft ground of widening savanna, you might feel a faint echo of what it meant to be halfway between two worlds. Not quite tree-dwelling, not yet truly terrestrial, just an animal negotiating its place in an environment of uncertainty. We do not know every detail, much remains buried, eroded, or undiscovered. But the fossils we have tell us enough to sketch the outline of that transformation. Upright posture was not a sudden innovation. It was an answer whispered slowly by climate, by terrain, by opportunity. And the question that remains is not how our ancestors stood up, but how that simple act reshaped everything that followed. So much of what we will explore next grows from this moment, when an ape first balanced its future on two uncertain legs. If you enjoy learning like this, calmly, without noise, a gentle like or subscribe helps other sleepless sapiens find their way here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? In bed, on a long drive, cooking, or on headphones, letting the world go quiet? And if you drift off, don't worry, there are timestamps below. You can always find your way back. All right, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine this: a small-bodied hominin standing at the edge of a familiar grove, looking out toward land it has never crossed. No language to name the hills, no fire to shape the night, no tools to help carry anything forward, and yet something in that landscape pulls it, as if the ground itself is whispering a direction. Between 3 million and 2 million years ago, long before our lineage learned how to think in symbols or plan with precision, early humans were already covering distances that their ancestors would never have imagined. The first long paths were not heroic journeys or bold migrations. They were simply the roots of survival in a world that kept widening. What we see in the fossil record from this era is not a single species, but a set of early walkers living in a landscape both generous and unpredictable, Australopithecus, spread across regions of eastern and southern Africa, inhabited environments where resources were seldom evenly distributed. A grove might fruit for a season, and then fail the next. A water source could shrink during a dry period and reappear years later. These rhythms were not catastrophic, they were the ordinary cycles of an older world. But for creatures who still relied heavily on the ground for daily movement, these cycles pushed bodies toward wider ranges. No one intended to walk far. The land simply made it necessary. When researchers examine the distribution of Australopithecus fossils across East Africa, a pattern of dispersed sites emerges that would be difficult to explain if these hominins had strict territorial boundaries. The distances between fossil localities are too great to represent isolated populations with narrow ranges. Instead, they hint at creatures comfortable moving through broad habitats, following resources as they shifted across seasons. Some sites show evidence of riverine forests, others open grasslands. Still others are mosaics where woodland and savanna meet in slow-moving waves. To live in such environments meant travelling between them, sometimes across days and weeks. And that travel shaped the body in ways subtle but persistent. A key source of evidence for these ranges lies not only in bones, but in the stable isotopes preserved within them. Teeth and skeletal remains record the chemical signatures of the plants thriving in their environment. In the enamel of Australopithecus, the ratio of carbon isotopes reveals a diet drawn from both woodland resources and more open grassland varieties. This mix is a signature of flexibility, but also of movement. Few small habitats contain that diversity in one place. It suggests individuals traverse several ecological zones over their lives, consuming different foods as they accessed different landscapes. Mobility was not a choice, it was built into their ecology. As the world progressed toward 2 million years ago, new members of our lineage stepped onto the stage. Early Homo, slightly larger in brain volume and subtly reshaped in body proportions, began to appear in sites across Africa. Their fossils are dispersed across surprisingly distant regions, from places near the eastern Rift Valley to zones far south where entirely different ecosystems prevailed. This distribution is unlikely to reflect repeated long-range migrations in the sense we understand them. Rather, it suggests populations expanding their home territories gradually, generation after generation, over broad tracts of land. These early humans were not deliberate explorers. They were, in a quiet way, opportunists shaped by an environment that offered resources unevenly distributed across space. Seasonal lakes, shifting riverbanks, patches of edible vegetation that flourished after rains and disappeared with drought. To survive, early Homo likely needed to walk further than their Australopithecine ancestors, but without complex mental maps or long-term planning. Their movement was guided by immediate cues: scent of water, signs of fruiting trees, the calls of prey species, or the distant rumble of storms. Each cue redirected their steps. Over time, these simple decisions stretched into distances that no individual intended to cover. We can see the imprint of this mobility in the wear patterns on teeth, in the distribution of stone flakes that appear in early contexts, and in the clusters of bones scattered across sites that suggest repeated occupation by small bands. Even before tools became common, these early humans were selecting places that gave them predictable returns. A clearing with edible plants here, a marsh with access to water there, a grove that sheltered fruit trees during certain seasons. These were reference points, slowly mapped by bodies, not minds, and between them lay long paths walked out of necessity rather than curiosity. What is remarkable is how this movement required no complex cognition in its earliest form. Animals across the world follow resource gradients without planning, and our ancestors were no different. The difference was time. Year after year, these paths widened. People learned them through memory at first, and then through repetition. Parents walked them. Offspring followed. In a world without fixed shelters or stored food, the land itself became home, and home was defined by the roots needed to survive. One of the quiet lessons of this era is that mobility predates the abilities we often link to later humans. Before we controlled fire, before we made tools common enough to influence our survival, our ancestors were walking through a world that asked them to expand their horizons. When climates shifted unpredictably during this period, regions that once held abundant forests became patchworks of thorn scrub and grassland. This meant fewer reliable fruiting trees and greater distances between dependable resources. Populations that remained too stationary simply vanished from areas where they could not secure food or water. Populations that adapted by widening their ranges persisted, leaving behind bones in far-flung locales. This does not mean that early Homo walked in straight purposeful lines as modern humans might imagine. Their paths would have been winding, shaped by topography, vegetation, danger, and opportunity. Geological studies of ancient lake basins in East Africa reveal how dramatically water sources shifted through centuries. A lake that once sustained large animals could shrink to half its size within a few centuries, pushing every species around it into new routes. Early humans, as part of this broader ecological network, followed these changes like threads woven into a moving tapestry. If we were somehow able to follow one of these beings for a year, watching how it navigated, we might experience something like a living map slowly forming. A watering place used at the end of the dry season, a grove that fruit trees revived in early rains, a slope that offered shade in the heat of midday, a path that skirted the ranges of large predators. These landscapes were not just physical spaces, they were lived memories, retained in muscles, in instinct, in the faint landmarks that might not mean anything to us now, but held significance. Then trace elements within teeth reveal even more about these early paths. Some individuals grew up eating plants in one region, only to shift to a different chemical signature later in life, implying movement across vast ecological boundaries. It is one of the earliest examples we have of childhood spent in one environment and adulthood in another. This alone suggests that movement was not merely local, but regional, and that populations explored or expanded into unfamiliar areas generation after generation. There is something humbling in that pattern. These were not people with the cognitive tools we take for granted. They were bodies solving environmental problems by moving through a world that invited them to wander. As we move further into this period, another important factor emerges: population spread. Fossils of early Homo appear in both East and Southern Africa within relatively short spans of geological time. The distances between these regions are vast. especially for beings still adapting to upright locomotion. Yet the evidence suggests no dramatic migration events. Instead, small bands drifted outward as resources invited them into new zones. Each generation walked a little further than the last, exploring rivers, valleys, and open plains as they found them over tens of thousands of years. These small steps accumulated into continental dispersal. The land itself in this era was a shifting partner. Vegetation maps reconstructed from ancient pollen show that areas of Africa experience pulses of greening and drying. During greener periods, early humans could access more diverse foods across broader areas, encouraging movement. During drier periods, they would retreat to ecological refuges where water persisted. In both cases, walking was the tool that linked one opportunity to the next. The brain did not yet orchestrate strategy. The body simply followed need. There is also a softer dimension to this story. When we speak of early humans moving before they thought, we're not imagining mindless creatures. Rather, their cognition did not yet rely on complex symbolic planning or flexible imagination. Their world was sensory. Patterns of shade and heat, the smell of rain approaching, the calls of other animals, the feel of plant textures indicating edibility. These cues form the earliest scaffolding of spatial awareness, and as these beings walk through their environments, these cues stitch themselves into a lived mental map, forming the first outlines of what we now call orientation. Many of the places they walked have vanished under sediment or erosion. Others survive in the form of dried lake beds and rocky slopes where their fossilized remains were later found. But the distribution of these sites reveals something more than geographic spread. It reveals a rhythm, a pattern of repeated presence across corridors that must have been walked generation after generation. The first long paths of humanity were not highways. They were narrow tracks worn into ecosystems by repetition, becoming part of the land's memory, even as the walkers themselves left no names for them. By the time we approach 2 million years ago, the pattern becomes clear. Our ancestors moved far before they understood the consequences of moving. Their ranges expanded not through strategy, but through necessity. And yet this simple act of following shifting landscapes became one of the most defining features of later human identity. Much that would eventually unfold in the story of our species grows from this early period, when walking was not an innovation but a condition of survival. If we look back now and try to understand what pulled them forward across the land, the answer is both simple and profound. It was the need to eat, the need to drink, the need to avoid danger, and the need to respond to a world that never stopped rearranging its resources. But woven into that necessity was something else, something almost invisible. The beginning of a relationship between human bodies and the spaces they inhabited. As these early walkers traversed their regions, their motion carved the first lines across the vast canvas of Africa, lines that would later stretch across continents and shape the very nature of humanity. Standing here now, millions of years later, we can only follow those paths through the fragments left behind. Isotopes, fossils, sediments, scattered bones. They're enough to reveal a truth about our origins that feels both clear and incomplete. Our ancestors walked because the world asked them to, long before they understood what that meant, and every step laid down a future they could not have imagined. An early human standing under a rising sun more than 2 million years ago, its shadow stretching across the open plain. It is not large, it is not especially fast, its teeth are not impressive, its claws do not exist. Yet something about this creature is new, something almost invisible at first glance. Its body is quietly being rebuilt for a different kind of survival. Not a burst of speed, not a show of force, but something far stranger and far more enduring. The ability to keep moving when every other animal must stop. If evolution had a signature experiment for our lineage, it was not strength or ferocity. It was distance. Between roughly 2 million and 800,000 years ago, the hominins who would eventually give rise to us underwent one of the most dramatic, yet least glamorous transformations in the animal kingdom. They became endurance specialists, not in the heroic sense of running marathons with purpose, but in the deeper anatomical sense of becoming bodies designed to travel far, recover quickly, and maintain motion long after other predators or competitors would overheat, collapse, or retreat. It is here that the raw blueprint for our unusual physiology emerged, stitched into our muscles, our bones, and our skin by a world that rarely stayed still. To understand this change, you have to imagine the landscapes our ancestors navigated. Africa during this era was a continent of shifting mosaics. Grasslands expanded in some regions while woodlands contracted. River systems altered their paths. Climate oscillated between wetter intervals and long dry stretches. The animals around early Homo ranged widely across these ecosystems, moving toward resources as they changed with the seasons. If our ancestors were going to survive among them, they needed to move too, and not just move, but keep moving for long enough to stay connected to the opportunities unfolding across vast areas of land. The body responded to this pressure with solutions that no one could have anticipated. One of the first hints of this transformation lies in the legs. Compared to their australopithecine ancestors, early members of Homo developed longer lower limbs relative to their torsos. This change might seem simple, but longer legs increase stride length and reduce the energy required for each step. Over many hours, small advantages compound. A creature with longer legs can travel greater distances on less metabolic fuel. This shift was not about speed. It was about efficiency. And efficiency is the foundation of endurance. Another important modification was the thickening and strengthening of the Achilles tendon. This remarkable band of connective tissue connects the calf muscles to the heel. In most quadrupedal mammals, tendons play a role in locomotion, but in humans, the Achilles tendon functions as a powerful energy storage system. With each step, it stretches and recoils like a spring, returning energy that would otherwise be lost. Some scientists estimate that this mechanism can save more than half of the energy needed for walking and running. For a creature dependent on long distances, this was an extraordinary evolutionary gift, but perhaps the most surprising system to evolve during this era was thermoregulation. In a world where scavenging or foraging might require long hours exposed to direct sun, overheating was a constant danger. Most animals rely on panting to cool down, which limits how long they can exert themselves before their internal temperature rises to fatal levels. Early humans solved this challenge through an unlikely avenue: the skin. As hair thinned across the body and sweat glands multiplied, early Homo became one of the rare mammals capable of cooling itself efficiently through evaporative sweating rather than rapid breathing. This allowed activity during hours when other animals rested in the shade. It also allowed movement in open terrain where direct sun exposure was intense. The skeletal structure of the torso also underwent a series of small but consequential changes. The appearance of the nuchal ligament, a long band of connective tissue running from the back of the skull to the spine, is one of the most distinctive markers of endurance potential. This ligament stabilizes the head during locomotion, especially when the body experiences repetitive impacts. Quadrupedal animals with no need to stabilize an upright skull lack this structure. But in early Homo, the nichal ligament provided a way to keep the head aligned while the body moved rhythmically over long distances. It seems like an unremarkable detail until you picture what happens without it. The head would bob uncontrollably with every step, making prolonged motion exhausting. Another essential part of this transformation is the gluteal complex, especially the large gluteus maximus. No other primate has anything quite like this muscle. In chimpanzees and gorillas it is small, used mostly for climbing or brief postural adjustments. But in Homo, the gluteus maximus enlarges into one of the most powerful muscles in the body. Its function is stability during locomotion. It keeps the torso from pitching forward. It absorbs the forces generated by each stride. It allows an upright creature to maintain posture through long hours of motion. Without this muscle, the idea of travelling far becomes almost impossible. It is one of the quiet anatomical signatures of a lineage built to move. The chest and shoulders also adapted in subtle ways. Early Homo developed a broader, more balanced thorax that allowed for more efficient respiration. Unlike quadrupedal mammals, whose breathing is linked to stride patterns, humans evolved to breathe flexibly even during long sessions of exertion. This decoupling of breathing from limb movement is a rare trait. It allows sustained oxygen intake regardless of pace, terrain, or posture. For an animal that needed to maintain steady motion through shifting habitats, this was a profound advantage. And then there is the matter of joints and durability. The human knee, often considered fragile in modern life, actually represents a remarkable compromise between stability and flexibility. Its expanded surface areas help spread load across the joint during repetitive motion. The alignment of the femur and tibia creates a mechanical pathway that reduces energy consumption over time. The ankle and foot, too, underwent restructuring. The midfoot stiffened to form a stable lever. The big toe aligned with the rest of the foot rather than opposing it as in earlier apes. These shifts did not happen all at once. They appeared gradually across species, suggesting slow but persistent selection pressures, favouring individuals who could keep moving through widely spaced resources. One of the fascinating aspects of this period is how anatomical evidence aligns with environmental changes documented through geological and paleobotanical records. Sediments from ancient basins show cycles of drying and greening. Pollen trapped in lake cores reveals waves of vegetation change. Large herbivores, whose fossilized remains often appear near early Homo sites, indicate ecosystems where wide-ranging grazers and browsers were common. To survive near animals that could move swiftly across vast distances, early humans needed similar stamina, not to rival them in speed, but to remain in ecological rhythm with their movements. Even the shape of the human foot arch tells a story from this era. The longitudinal arch acts like a shock absorber, reducing impact forces during repetitive steps and returning elastic energy. It also helps stabilize the foot during uneven terrain traversal. No other primate evolved such a structure. It is a hallmark of a creature expected to travel long distances across varied landscapes. What remains humbling is how all these elements work together to create something new in nature. Not a runner in the modern sense, not a walker alone, but a creature adapted for sustained, flexible motion across hours, days, and seasons. Motion that allowed access to distant water sources. Motion that allowed following herds. Motion that allowed navigating landscapes where food or shade could not be counted on. This was not a heroic adaptation. It was a necessary one. But while the transformation was powerful, it was also costly. Upright endurance came with anatomical risks. The spine, forced into an S-shaped curve to absorb shock, became susceptible to disc problems. The foot, rigidified for propulsion, lost some of the grasping ability that earlier hominins used in trees. The pelvis, reshaped for support, imposed new challenges for childbirth endurance. Specialization was not a perfect solution. It was a trade-off like all evolutionary pathways, yet it was enough to set our lineage on a path that no other primate took. As the environment continued to shift through the early part of this period, endurance gave early Homo an edge in surviving widespread ecological change. When a lake retreated or a forest thinned, they could adjust their range without abandoning entire regions. This mobility became part of their adaptive toolkit. And although the cognitive side of humanity had not yet taken shape, the body was already building a framework for future behaviours that would depend on long-term mobility. If you imagine one of these early humans moving across the landscape, the experience would be quiet and rhythmic, a steady pace, a body balanced by tendons and ligaments, fine-tuned over generations, skin cooling with sweat, breath low and controlled, a stride neither fast nor slow, but calibrated for energy conservation. In this simple, continuous motion, we glimpse the first form of human endurance, a trait that would later underpin everything from migration to resource gathering. Looking back across those ancient millennia, we can see that endurance was not something added to humanity at the last moment. It was built into our foundation. Before complex tools, before art, before fire became a constant companion. Endurance shaped our lineage while our minds were still learning to grasp the world. It is perhaps the most primordial of our abilities, a reminder that our bodies were crafted by landscapes that valued those who could simply keep going. And the question that lingers now is how this quiet, powerful adaptation influenced all that followed. How much of our later success was rooted not in intellect or creativity, but in the ability to endure? The answer remains incomplete, as the evidence speaks softly. But from what we do know, endurance emerges as one of the earliest and most defining characteristics of the beings who would eventually become us a superpower, not of speed, but of time. An antelope standing alert beneath a white African sun, its muscles coiled, its breath sharp, its vision scanning the plain for movement. It can outrun almost any predator. It can leap, twist, disappear into heat shimmering above the grass. Yet somewhere behind it, an upright primate begins to follow. Not quickly, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet, relentless patience. Every time the antelope sprints, the primate keeps its pace. Every time the antelope slows, the primate closes the distance again. Hours pass, the sun hardens, the air thickens, and the animal built for bursts of power finally makes a mistake. It overheats. That is when the primate catches up. Between 800,000 and 200,000 years ago, Homo became something the world had never seen before. A hunter who did not need to be fast, strong, or armed with imposing natural weapons. Instead, our ancestors learned to use the landscape, the climate, and their own peculiar physiology to exhaust animals that should have easily escaped them. This slow, deliberate method is known as persistence hunting, and although it appears almost unbelievable to modern eyes, the evidence from anthropology, physiology, and archaeology suggests it was one of the earliest successful hunting strategies used by early humans long before complex technology shaped their survival. To grasp how this worked, we must step into an Africa where the midday heat was not a danger but an opportunity. Most quadrupedal mammals cool themselves by panting. Panting moves air rapidly over moist surfaces in the mouth and respiratory tract, which helps dissipate heat. But panting only functions efficiently when the animal is not running. Once the animal begins galloping or sprinting, it must breathe in sync with its stride, and panting becomes impossible. As a result, even the swiftest antelope or zebra can only run in short bursts before its internal temperature begins to rise rapidly. If it cannot stop to cool down, it enters a physiological crisis. Humans, by contrast, evolved a different system. We began to sweat profusely across the surface of the skin, losing water but shedding heat even while in motion. As long as we could keep replacing fluids, we could run or jog for hours without reaching dangerous core temperatures. When we remember that these adaptations emerged from earlier periods in which endurance became a critical survival tool, it becomes easier to understand how a creature with no claws and no fangs could eventually bring down game much larger than itself. What makes persistence hunting so distinctive is that it relies on a combination of physical and ecological knowledge that does not require advanced technology. It requires the ability to track, to anticipate, and to understand how heat stress affects prey. Archaeological evidence does not give us direct snapshots of specific hunts from this distant period, but the dispersal of early Homo fossils, the distribution of animal remains with cut marks, and the ecological settings of ancient sites all point toward a strategy that depended on following animals over long distances rather than defeating them in sudden attacks. One crucial component of this method was tracking. A hunter who could follow footprints, subtle changes in soil, broken blades of grass, or the direction of fleeing herds could maintain pursuit even when the prey temporarily disappeared from view. The training for this kind of tracking was not formal. It was embedded in daily life. Children growing up in these landscapes would have learned to read the signs of movement as naturally as they learned to walk. By the time they attempted their first hunts, their eyes were already shaped by thousands of quiet lessons given by the land. As the hunter followed, the animal would sprint away whenever it sensed danger, but after each burst, it needed to rest. The hunter, maintaining a steady pace, would close the gap again. This cycle repeated until the animal reached a point where it could no longer reduce its rising internal temperature. Its legs might shake. Its breathing would become shallow. Eventually it would collapse, and at that moment the hunter, still able to regulate heat through sweat, would approach and deliver the final blow. This method seems incredibly energy intensive, and it was. But the hundreds of thousands of years during which these adaptations were shaped created a body capable of such labour. The long legs of early Homo made each stride efficient. This spring of the Achilles tendon reduced the cost of repetitive motion. The stabilization provided by the gluteal muscles kept posture aligned during prolonged running, and the nuchal ligament prevented the head from pitching forward or backward during uneven terrain traversed in heat. Each piece was essential to a strategy that did not depend on speed or aggression, but on patience and physiology. The environments where persistence hunting likely flourished were open savannas and semi-arid grasslands, regions where shade was sparse and direct sunlight intense. In such places, prey animals cannot easily escape the heat. When the only shade exists beneath isolated trees, the hunter can use these shadows as checkpoints, anticipating where an overheated animal might try to rest. By arriving just as the prey stops, the hunter forces it to run again, compounding its heat stress. This cycle can last several hours. Fossil pollen, ancient soil chemistry, and faunal remains from sites dated to this period indicate ecosystems where such conditions were frequent. The distribution of large game remains bearing cut marks from early stone tools suggest that early humans regularly processed carcasses of animals far larger than themselves. While some of this may reflect scavenging, the repeated appearance of butchery marks on fresh bone indicates that early Homo often accessed carcasses before other carnivores could tear them apart. Persistence hunting offers one plausible explanation. An overheated animal would collapse alive, leaving the body available for immediate processing with stone tools brought by the hunters. Ethnographic parallels, though not perfect analogues, show how this strategy can function in environments similar to those of ancient Africa. Some modern hunter-gatherer groups have been documented using persistence techniques to bring down antelope, using nothing more than knowledge of the land and a remarkable understanding of animal behaviour. While we cannot assume direct continuity between these practices and those of early Homo, the physiological similarities between these hunters and ancient humans suggest that long-distance pursuit might have been one of the earliest forms of cooperative hunting. Another key factor was the rhythm of movement. Persistence hunters alternated between walking and running, conserving energy, while maintaining just enough pressure on the prey to prevent it from cooling. This walk-run rhythm was not invented in a single moment. It emerged from the very structure of the hominin body as it adapted to the mosaic landscapes of the time-endurance physiology-shaped gait patterns, breathing patterns, and even behavioural instincts. Over tens of thousands of generations, these rhythms became part of the identity of our lineage. It is tempting to imagine these hunts as dramatic chases, but in reality they were likely quiet and methodical. A hunter might begin pursuit when the sun was still low and end after midday when the heat was at its peak. Each step was taken without hurry. Each clue on the ground was examined without panic. There was no need to rush. The sun did the difficult work, the hunter simply kept moving. What makes this method so astonishing is that it inverted the rules of predation. Most predators rely on speed, stealth, or power. Humans, in contrast, use the vulnerabilities built into the physiology of other animals. Heat became a weapon. Endurance became a strategy. And by pursuing prey long enough, early Homo gained access to high-calorie resources that could fuel further survival and reproduction. The archaeological signature of this period also shows an increase in the variety of animals processed at ancient sites. Bones of species that are usually difficult to hunt appear with cut marks and evidence of marrow extraction. This suggests that early humans could bring down game that would have been nearly impossible to capture through short, fast chases. Persistence hunting democratized access to the animal world. It allowed relatively small, cooperative groups to acquire meat and fat that would later support brain expansion and further behavioral complexity. Yet, it is important to be cautious. Not all regions would have favoured persistence hunting. Dense forests or mountainous terrain would have made tracking and sustained pursuit far more difficult. The best evidence supports this method in open, hot environments, where visibility and heat stress favoured human physiology. Our understanding is shaped by fossil distributions, modern analogies, and biomechanical studies rather than direct observation. Much remains uncertain, but enough pieces exist to suggest that, at least in some parts of Africa between 800,000 and 200,000 years ago, early humans regularly used persistence as a hunting strategy. If you imagine one of these hunts unfolding, the scene becomes almost surreal. The prey sprints, dust rising behind its hooves. The hunter moves at a steady pace. Hours pass, heat thickens the air, the animal begins to falter. The hunter continues. No urgency, no spectacle. Just a species using the one advantage evolution carved into its bones, the ability to keep going. Looking back now, it is clear that persistence hunting was not simply a technique. It was a way of being, a partnership between physiology and landscape. A method of survival that required no complex tools, no sudden bursts of speed, only determination shaped by millions of years of adaptation. And in that quiet, relentless pursuit, our ancestors rewrote the rules of predation. They became the hunters who wore the world down. An early human walking across a landscape of tall grass and scattered trees, one hand closing around a fallen branch. It is nothing special, just a length of wood stripped smooth by weather and time. Yet the moment fingers curl around it, something changes. Balance shifts. Posture settles. The body feels more certain of itself, as if some ancient agreement between hand and world has been momentarily restored. Long before we shaped stone into blades or learned to spark fire on command, we lifted sticks from the ground. And in doing so, our ancestors discovered that the simplest objects could reshape the way we move through the world between roughly 2 million and 300,000 years ago. Early members of Homo were not yet the master tool makers they would later become, but they were experimenters. They lived in landscapes full of raw materials, wood, bone, plant fibers, each offering subtle advantages when put to use. While stone tools survive in abundance because they fossilize easily, wooden tools seldom do. The few that remain from later periods are rare treasures, preserved by unusual conditions. But even without direct artifacts from this early era, the evidence from primate behavior, hominin anatomy, where patterns on stone-associated animal remains, and the ecological pressures of the time all converge on a simple truth. Wooden tools shaped our evolution long before stone ones dominated our imagination. One of the earliest and most versatile objects carried by early humans was the digging stick. A sturdy branch with a sharpened end could be used to extract roots and tubers from the ground, pry apart termite mounds, or uncover small animals hidden beneath soil. To use such a tool efficiently, a hominin needed only basic grasp strength and the insight to modify a branch by stripping bark or charring the tip to harden it. These are not complicated behaviors. Modern chimpanzees modify branches in similar ways, but when early Homo applied these strategies across expanding grasslands, the consequences were profound. A digging stick expanded diet, broadened ecological flexibility, and required individuals to carry tools longer distances as they moved through diverse environments. Carrying such a stick influenced gait more than we often imagine. When an early human walked with a digging stick, it served as a counterbalance that subtly stabilized the body. The mass of the tool acted like a pendulum, reducing side-to-side sway and helping maintain a steady forward momentum. Biomechanical studies of humans carrying asymmetric loads show how the body instinctively adjusts posture, muscle activation, and stride without conscious effort. Even a small weight in one hand can alter center of mass in ways that make walking more efficient on uneven terrain. If this is true for us today, it was likely even more impactful for early hominins with bodies still refining the mechanics of upright locomotion. Another simple wooden tool was the probing stick. The landscapes inhabited by early Homo were full of uncertainty. Holes in the ground could hide snakes or burrowing animals. Patches of vegetation might conceal thorns or insects. A probing stick allowed individuals to test the environment before committing their bodies to it. Tapping the ground ahead provided feedback that reduced risk. Lifting branches to inspect what lay beneath prevented dangerous surprises. Over time, this behavior encouraged a new relationship with the world, one where the hands extended sensory information beyond the reach of skin and eyes. But perhaps one of the most intriguing uses of sticks during this era involves the transport of fire. We know from later evidence that early humans learned to maintain fire long before they mastered igniting it from scratch. Transporting embers required carrying smouldering branches from one location to another, shielding them from wind and managing heat. To hold such a branch demanded attentiveness, care, and an understanding of how wood burns. Even if this behavior originated later in the timeline, the skill of carrying branches safely, perhaps for defense or signaling, likely emerged earlier as hominins explored new landscapes where fire left behind by lightning could alter entire ecosystems. Carrying fire, even briefly, would have strengthened the bond between hand and stick, making familiarity with wooden tools part of everyday life. Evidence from the fossil record helps us infer the role of these tools. Early Homo had hands capable of powerful precision grips, with thumb-to-finger ratios approaching modern levels. The joints in their wrists and fingers show adaptations for forceful manipulation and rotational control needed for twisting or levering wooden objects. The skeletal proportions of their arms suggest a balance between strength and mobility, allowing for repeated use of upper limbs without prohibitive fatigue. Muscular skeletal modelling indicates that carrying objects naturally influenced arm swing, which in turn affected gait rhythm and torso stabilization. These changes were not dramatic but incremental, accumulated over thousands of generations as bodies grew accustomed to walking while holding tools. If we look beyond anatomy to the environment, the importance of wooden tools becomes clearer. Many of the regions occupied by early Homo were seasonal landscapes where food availability shifted across the year. During dry seasons, edible roots buried deep in the soil became vital calories. Digging them out required leverage and force, tasks far easier with a stick than with bare hands. This created selective pressure not only for tool use, but for the ability to carry tools across distances. Individuals who could manage the balance of walking with a stick would have reached new sources of food more easily, survived droughts more reliably, and passed on their strategies to future generations. There is also evidence in animal bones from early sites that suggests the importance of wooden implements. Some bones show breakage patterns consistent with levering or prying, activities commonly performed with sticks rather than stone. Others display marks that might indicate the use of wooden wedges or clubs. While none of this is definitive, the cumulative pattern suggests tool use broader than stone flakes alone, and where stone was scarce, as in some wooded or riverine areas, wood would have been even more essential. As our ancestors carried sticks across longer and longer distances, their bodies adapted not only physically but behaviourally. A stick could be used to clear paths, move aside vegetation, or test water depth. Each use reinforced the connection between hand and object. Even when not actively using the tool, the habit of carrying it would have shaped posture. Biomechanical experiments show that holding a stick can reduce the amplitude of trunk rotation during walking, leading to smoother movement. It can also alter muscle activation patterns in the shoulders and core, subtly stabilizing the body on rough terrain. These small efficiencies, multiplied over millions of steps, contributed to the endurance-focused physiology emerging during this period. The emergence of proto-spears also begins in this window of time, though direct wooden spears from later periods provide stronger evidence. Even a simple sharpened branch used to threaten predators or test carcasses required a level of manual skill and spatial awareness. But more importantly, carrying such a tool influenced how individuals moved through dangerous areas. A stick in the hand changes the psychology of risk. It extends reach. It reshapes posture. It keeps the arms slightly elevated and the torso more upright. These subtle shifts alter centre of gravity and engage stabilizer muscles that contribute to balance. Over long distances, these changes accumulate into a distinctive way of walking, shaped as much by tools as by anatomy. There is something deeply human in this pattern. We often think of tools as inventions of intelligence, but long before our ancestors carved stone with purpose or shaped wood deliberately, they were already interacting with the world through objects. This interaction was not driven by curiosity or creativity at first, but by survival. A stick was simply the easier solution to many problems. Yet by adopting it, early Homo took a step toward the future in ways they could not understand. They expanded the range of their bodies beyond flesh and bone. They carried the environment in their hands. One of the most important consequences of this behavior was cultural rather than anatomical. The habit of carrying tools created opportunities for teaching, imitation, and shared practice. When one individual carried a branch for digging, others could observe and learn. Young hominins growing up around adults who routinely used sticks would begin experimenting earlier in life. This transmission of knowledge created a subtle form of continuity across generations, one that did not require language or symbolic thought. It simply required watching. And through watching, the use of sticks became part of group identity. This shift also influenced navigation. A stick held while walking changes how the world is perceived. It interacts with the ground before the feet do, giving early warnings about obstacles or unstable surfaces. This would have allowed early humans to travel more confidently through varied terrain, making longer journeys less risky. In a world full of hidden dangers, a probing branch extended awareness outward, turning each step into a dialogue between environment and body. As we approach the end of this period, we begin to see the earliest hints of more complex woodworking. Cut marks on animal bones sometimes appear, alongside impressions on wood from later sites, suggesting knowledge of how to shape branches with stone flakes. Even if true woodworking did not flourish until much later, the seeds of that skill lie here, in the basic familiarity of manipulating wooden objects. Through repetition, a simple piece of wood became a versatile tool, and carrying it reshaped both posture and possibility. Looking back across those long millennia, it becomes clear that the relationship between early humans and sticks was not incidental. It was foundational. Wooden tools were the first external aids our ancestors used to modify their environment and their own movements within it. The digging stick expanded diet. The probing stick expanded awareness. The fire-carrying branch expanded access to light and heat. The protospear expanded the ability to face danger, and carrying these tools over vast distances expanded the range of human habitation. If we hold a stick today and feel something instinctively familiar in the gesture, perhaps it is because this behavior is older than any technology we now admire. It is a memory carved into our species before fire, before complex stone tools, before the symbolic worlds we later built. A reminder that the very first tools were not weapons of mastery but companions of survival, shaping how our ancestors moved through landscapes that demanded both caution and endurance. And the question that lingers softly at the edges of this story is not why early humans picked up sticks, but how the simple act of carrying them altered the course of human evolution. In that ordinary gesture lay the beginnings of the extraordinary capacity to shape the world through objects held in the hand. Imagine this. The ground beneath your feet is the same, and yet never the same twice. A lake that once stretched across the horizon evaporates into a salt flat. A forest that sheltered your ancestors thins into scattered brush. A coastline you walked along as a child now lies hundreds of strides farther away, exposed by retreating waters. And above all this, the climate pulses in slow, powerful rhythms that no individual can understand, but every generation must obey. Between ancient cycles of ice and fire, early humans learned to navigate a planet that refused to stay still. They walked not across a static world, but across a living one that expanded, contracted, dried, drowned, froze, and thawed in endless repetition. Between roughly 2 million years ago and the later part of the Middle Pleistocene, Earth entered a period of climatic instability, unlike anything earlier hominins had experienced. The planet's orbit shifted on long cycles. Tilt wobbled. Seasons intensified. The world swung between long glacial intervals and warmer interglacials, each reshaping landscapes across Africa, Eurasia, and beyond. For early humans, these were not abstract climate events. They were lived realities that altered where water lay, where animals migrated, where edible plants grew, and where survival could be found. To endure such rhythms, humans did not build shelters or store food in the way later communities would. They walked. They followed the shifting edges of habitability, adjusting their ranges with every new ecological pulse. The earliest signs of these cycles come from deep sea cores that preserve tiny shells of plankton, each recording past temperatures like a diary written in calcium. When scientists examine these microfossils, they see patterns stretching across millions of years. Slight changes in Earth's orbit would trigger cooling trends. Ice sheets expanded at high latitudes. Sea levels dropped, exposing continental shelves. Then, thousands of years later, warmth returned, melting ice, reflooding coasts, and transforming plant communities. For early humans living in Africa and beyond, these transitions were subtle year by year but dramatic over generations. A river that supported herds during one era might vanish in another. A lush valley might become arid scrub. And entire regions could shift from green corridors to dusty barriers. What makes this period so fascinating is how closely early human presence aligns with these environmental shifts. Fossil sites from East Africa show hominin remains appearing in waves, often coinciding with intervals when climate oscillations created ecological diversity. During wetter interglacials, forests expanded and humans moved into them to forage on seasonal fruits and tubers. During cooler, drier glacial intervals, savannas sprawled across the landscape, drawing humans into open grasslands rich with grazers. This constant reshaping created opportunities but also pressures. Populations unable to adapt to shifting vegetation simply vanished from regions where change was too fast or too severe. Those who survived were the ones who could keep moving. Movement through these landscapes required more than endurance. It required the ability to read environmental cues. Early humans likely noticed changes in plant flowering, the shifting behavior of animals, the smell of dust-laden winds, or the subtle rise and fall of water levels. These signals functioned as silent maps. When the rains failed, herds moved toward the last remaining wetlands, and humans followed. When droughts crack the earth, people walk toward distant highlands where moisture lingered. When coastlines retreated during glacial periods, vast new plains emerged where marine life could be gathered. Each change redrew the boundaries of survival. One of the most remarkable examples of how climate shaped human mobility comes from the changing East African rift. Millions of years of tectonic activity created lakes that expanded and contracted over time. During interglacial periods, these lakes filled, attracting animals and humans alike. During glacial periods, they shrank, leaving salt flats or exposing new pathways between valleys. Studies of ancient shorelines show dramatic fluctuations that would have forced early humans to modify their ranges repeatedly. A band living near a lake shore might be pushed dozens of kilometers away within a few centuries. These movements were not migrations in the modern sense. They were expansions and contractions of territory in response to shifting water availability. Vegetation also responded strongly to climate pulses. Evidence from fossilized pollen trapped in lake sediments reveals a mosaic of forests, woodlands, and grasslands shifting across East Africa. Some intervals saw thick forests dominating the landscape. Others saw open savanna stretching as far as the eye could see. These changes were not gentle transitions, but dramatic flips between ecological states. Early humans who had once relied heavily on forest food suddenly faced open terrain where shade was sparse. Those comfortable in savanna landscapes found themselves adapting to woodland edges where new plant species thrived. With each shift, walking became the primary mechanism through which humans tracked resources. Walking through such variability required both anatomical capability and behavioral flexibility. The endurance adaptations that had begun earlier now proved invaluable. A body that could travel long distances without overheating had an advantage in a world where water sources could shift hundreds of kilometers across millennia. A foot designed to absorb shock and maintain balance across rocky ground became essential when landscapes dried out and vegetation thinned. A head stabilized by ligaments and posture could scan long distances for signs of storms, herds, or fire. And while early humans did not yet have the cognitive tools to understand why the world changed, they had the physical tools to adapt to those changes instinctively. One of the most significant consequences of glacial cycles was the exposure and flooding of coastal plains. When global temperatures dropped and ice sheets grew, sea levels fell by more than 100 meters, revealing vast areas now submerged. These newly exposed lands became rich habitats full of shellfish, tidal pools, and coastal resources. Early humans likely walked across these plains, exploiting the bounty left behind by receding seas. When warmth returned and the oceans rose again, these lands disappeared beneath the waves, pushing humans inland and forcing them to adapt once more. Such dynamism meant that no region remained stable for long. Those who thrived learned to see the landscape as temporary. Not permanent glacial periods also reshaped wind patterns. Dust records from deep-sea cores show that during colder intervals, winds carried fine particles across Africa, indicating drier conditions. These winds would have affected visibility, plant growth, and the availability of clean water. During these dusty times, early humans likely walked along river corridors or valley floors, where winds were less harsh and resources more predictably concentrated. In wetter intervals, when vegetation flourished, dispersal would have been easier, and human groups could expand across broader territories. The rhythm of these cycles shaped not only movement, but also population size. In lean times, bands may have contracted and sought refuge in ecological pockets. In abundant times, they likely spread outward, exploring new land. One of the most remarkable pieces of evidence for human adaptation to shifting climates comes from ancient footprints, literal traces of paths walked across landscapes now buried under sediments. At certain sites in East Africa, the prints of early humans appear alongside those of large animals, indicating shared trails. Some trackways show multiple individuals walking together, sometimes in parallel, sometimes in sequence. The spacing between steps reveals not only gait but the environment itself. Softer soil after rain, crisp edges under dry sun, deeper impressions near water. These footprints preserve moments when early humans walked through landscapes mid-transition, leaving behind temporary records on ground that would vanish under the next climatic shift. In their simplicity, they remind us that mobility was not optional. It was the foundation of survival. Even beyond Africa, climate cycles guided human movement. Lower sea levels created natural corridors across regions that are now isolated. Pathways across the Arabian Peninsula expanded during wetter intervals, allowing humans to explore areas that would otherwise have been uninhabitable deserts. In colder times, grasslands extended across Eurasia, providing migratory routes for both humans and the animals they followed. When warmth returned, forests closed these routes again. The world opened and closed like a breathing organism, and humans walked through its cycles. It is tempting to imagine early humans as passive passengers, on a climate-controlled planet, but the truth is that they responded actively to environmental change. Their choices were not conscious in the modern sense, but they were informed by experience, memory, and observation. A shrinking lake signalled the need to move. New growth following rains signalled opportunity. Shifts in animal movement signalled pathways. Walking allowed humans to update their understanding of the world in real time, linking sensory experience with survival decisions. In this light, long-distance mobility becomes more than a physical trait. It becomes an ecological strategy. It allowed humans to occupy landscapes undergoing constant reorganization. It gave them the ability to track the edges of habitability. It let them remain in balance with ecosystems that never settled for long. While other species specialized narrowly, some adapted to thick forests, others to open plains, humans embraced a generalist strategy shaped by motion. Over thousands of generations, this mobility created not only a flexible body, but also a flexible mind, one attuned to change rather than stability. As we reach the end of this period in deep time, one truth becomes clear. The human story has never been one of a fixed homeland or a stable environment. It has always been a tale of movement through landscapes of ice and fire, across coastlines that appeared and vanished, through forests that grew and burned, across plains that filled with life and then fell silent. Walking was the thread that held these chapters together, allowing early humans to weave their lives through climate cycles far grander than anything they could comprehend. And if there is a question that gently lingers after all of this, it is not how our ancestors survived such changes, but perhaps why motion became the default answer of our species. When the world never stops shifting its shape, the only constant is the road beneath your feet. Imagine this. You're following tracks across a plain at dawn. The air is cool, the earth still holding the memory of night, and before you lie only faint depressions in the soil and the smallest bends in grass. Nothing here speaks loudly. Nothing announces itself. Yet your mind begins to assemble a story. How fast the animal was moving when it passed, whether it was limping, whether it was alone, where it is likely to go next, and how far ahead it might be. Every step you take adds another piece to the puzzle, and although you cannot see the animal, you can feel its direction, its pace, even its intention. In this moment, walking is not just locomotion, it is cognition. You're thinking with your feet, your eyes, and something deeper, something that evolution has been sculpting quietly for hundreds of thousands of years. Between roughly 200,000 and 60,000 years ago, humans underwent a subtle but profound shift. Their bodies were already adapted for endurance, for long days of following animals through open landscapes, but survival required more than stamina. It required the ability to predict, to remember, to imagine. And many scientists now believe that some of the earliest roots of human intelligence did not emerge around fires, or in moments of sudden insight, but out on these long paths across earth and grass and sand. Tracking demanded an entirely new way of thinking, weaving memory, perception, and imagination into a single continuous act. What makes tracking so cognitively demanding is that it's not simply observing footprints, it is reconstructing movement through time. A track is a clue, not a conclusion. A broken stem or a displaced stone tells part of a story, but the tracker must supply the rest. This requires episodic memory, the mental ability to recall past experiences and use them to make predictions. To follow an antelope, early humans needed to remember where herds usually traveled during dry seasons, where water might linger after storms, and which paths predators typically blocked. They also needed to hold these memories while constantly updating their internal map as new information appeared. Neurological research suggests that this kind of mapping relies heavily on the hippocampus, a structure deep in the brain involved in spatial navigation. Studies on modern humans show that people who navigate complex environments develop stronger neural pathways in this region. Long before cities or written maps existed, early humans were likely strengthening these pathways through daily movement across wide territories. Every journey carved a little more memory into the brain. Every successful prediction refined neural circuits that would later support far more abstract reasoning. But tracking also required something even more advanced, the ability to imagine possibilities. If the animal turned suddenly, the tracker had to ask why. Did it hear something? Did it smell something? Did it sense danger? This means early humans were engaged in mental simulations long before they had the words to describe them. They had to place themselves into the mind of another species, predicting routes based on behavior rather than instinct alone. This blending of observation and imagination may be one of the earliest forms of what we now call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other beings have their own motivations and perceptions. Walking long distances made this cognitive process continuous. The mind could not wander too far from the task. Each step required attention to terrain, shifting shadows, patterns of grass, and scents carried by the wind. Over hours, this sustained engagement shaped neural endurance. The brain learned to hold information without losing it, to stay focused without fatigue, and to shift between detail and the bigger picture seamlessly. These are the same cognitive abilities that later supported language, planning, ritual, and abstract thought. Long-distance tracking, in a sense, was an early training ground for human intelligence. Another key aspect of tracking was error correction. Animal tracks are never perfect. Wind erases them, rain distorts them, herds overlap them. A skilled tracker had to interpret partial, misleading, or contradictory information. This demanded flexibility of mind. Instead of clinging to a single interpretation, trackers had to revise their assumptions constantly. Cognitive scientists call this executive function, the ability to shift strategies when new evidence appears. For early humans, this ability was not a luxury, but a necessity. A mistaken assumption could mean wasting valuable energy or losing sight of prey entirely. Walking itself contributed to this cognitive flexibility. Movement creates a rhythm, a pacing that helps the brain process information. As early humans walked, they stabilized their thoughts through motion. Footsteps offered a tempo for memory, grounding predictions in physical sensation. This rhythm may have supported the integration of sensory inputs, allowing early humans to combine visual, auditory, tactile, and olfactory cues into a coherent understanding of their surroundings. In many ways, walking transformed the environment into a living classroom in which every step reinforced learning. Tracking also required cooperation. Groups often pursued prey together, sharing observations and correcting one another's interpretations. This meant communication, long before sophisticated language, had to evolve to convey direction, distance, and subtle environmental cues. A gesture toward displaced grass, a soft vocalization indicating a fresh scent, a glance toward a distant tree line. These were the building blocks of a shared mental world. Over time, this cooperative attention laid the groundwork for more complex forms of social cognition. To track effectively, individuals had to align their perceptions, anticipate each other's insights, and trust shared interpretations. This mutual mind reading strengthened the cognitive bonds within groups. One of the most striking insights from anthropological research is how deep this form of intelligence runs. In communities today that maintain traditional tracking practices, children begin learning almost as soon as they can walk. They follow elders across sand or grass, absorbing how to read the world through movement. These skills are not taught through formal instruction, but through exposure and imitation. Long before symbolic teaching, early humans probably transmitted knowledge in this same silent way. Tracking was, in effect, one of the earliest forms of education, shaping both memory and culture. As humans expanded into new regions, including cooler climates and more varied landscapes, the demands on tracking cognition grew more complex. Footprints in snow behaved differently than footprints in sand. Trails in dense vegetation require skill in reading broken stems rather than clear depressions. Different animals leave different signs, and new ecosystems presented puzzles without historical precedent. Each expansion into unfamiliar territory forced early humans to update their mental maps, reinforcing neural plasticity and encouraging innovative thinking. This constant adaptation may explain why humans became such flexible problem solvers across diverse environments. But what is most fascinating is how walking and tracking together formed a feedback loop. The more humans walked, the larger their experiential maps became. The larger their maps became, the more effectively they could predict animal movement. The more effectively they predicted, the farther they could travel with confidence. This cycle reinforced itself generation after generation, gradually shaping minds capable of planning days ahead, remembering landscapes no longer visible, and imagining events that had not yet happened. These abilities are foundational to what we now consider human intelligence. Episodic memory allows us to recall past events. Spatial reasoning allows us to navigate. Prediction and planning allow us to envision futures. Cooperation allows us to share knowledge. All these traits may have begun, in part, as adaptations for walking and tracking across vast, shifting worlds. The mind learned to move through time much as the body moved through space. If we follow this thread, we begin to see intelligence not as a sudden leap, but as a slow accumulation of cognitive habits shaped by landscapes that demanded constant interpretation. Early humans did not sit still and think their way into modern cognition. They walked and thought simultaneously. They learned because the world did not allow them to remain in one place. Intelligence emerged not from isolation, but from motion. As we approach the later part of this era, around 60,000 years ago, humans were already showing signs of symbolic thought, complex planning, and expansive social networks. But beneath these achievements lies an older, quieter layer of cognition, built on the long paths crossed by earlier generations. Tracking may be one of the oldest bridges between the physical and mental worlds. To follow a trail is to hold the past, present, and possible future in mind at once. And in doing so, early humans rehearsed the very mental skills that would one day give rise to art, language, mythology, and science. As we approach the later part of this era, around 60,000 years ago, humans were already showing signs of symbolic thought, complex planning, and expansive social networks. But beneath these achievements lies an older, quieter layer of cognition built on the long paths crossed by earlier generations. Tracking may be one of the oldest bridges between the physical and mental worlds. To follow a trail is to hold the past, present, and possible future in mind at once. And in doing so, early humans rehearsed the very mental skills that would one day give rise to art, language, mythology, and science. Looking back now, it is tempting to imagine intelligence evolving in caves or around fires, in moments of revelation or creativity. But the evidence whispers a different possibility. Perhaps the first truly human thoughts arose not in stillness, but in motion. Perhaps the world itself was the first classroom, its tracks and signs the first lessons, and perhaps the mind evolved because the body wandered. because survival required a brain capable of keeping pace with the journey. You're walking at dawn, not quickly, not slowly, but at a pace tuned so precisely to the land that your footsteps barely disturb the soil. The light is soft, the air cool, and everything around you seems ordinary at first glance. Blades of grass, shifting shadows, a line of shrubs against the horizon. But as you move, the world reshapes itself. A single bent stem reveals direction. A patch of disturbed dust suggests speed. A faint scent on the wind hints at how long ago another creature passed this way. You begin to notice details you were blind to moments earlier. And the longer you walk, the more the landscape becomes readable, as if some ancient script is being written and rewritten beneath your feet. This quiet skill, the ability to follow tracks through sight, sound, memory and motion, is one of the oldest sciences humans ever learned. Between roughly 60,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, tracking evolved into a mastery practiced across deserts, forests, and tundra. This era spans the great dispersals of Homo sapiens across the globe, the final millennia of Ice Age climates, and the last chapters before sedentary life began. In these long millennia, walking was not simply a form of movement, it was a form of perception. The brain, body and senses fused into a single instrument tuned to the landscape, and to follow a track was to use that instrument fully, an act requiring attention so deep that even the rhythm of walking guided how the world was perceived. One of the most important concepts in tracking is visual flow, the way objects move across the visual field as we walk. Most of the time we're not aware of it, but the brain uses visual flow to stabilize perception, predict movement, and detect anomalies in the environment. For early humans, this flow became a silent guide. When the world moved across the eyes in a predictable pattern, the mind recognized smooth motion. But when something in that pattern broke, a rock shifted slightly, a clump of grass bent in an unusual direction, a colour mismatch where soil should be uniform, the brain detected it instantly. These micro-detections, accumulated over hours of walking, constructed a pathway through landscapes that offered no clear signs to the untrained eye. Peripheral vision played an equally vital role. The edges of sight are sensitive to motion and contrast, and trackers relied on this sensitivity to detect where an animal brushed past vegetation or disturbed a surface. Ethnographic accounts from hunter-gatherer communities show that skilled trackers rarely stare directly at tracks. Instead, they walk with their gaze soft, taking in broad patterns while letting peripheral cues alert them to subtle changes. In this mode, vision becomes less about focusing and more about scanning. Details filter into awareness not through conscious searching, but through the mind's ability to sense irregularities in a landscape it knows intimately. Walking itself reinforced the act of seeing. Each step created a natural rhythm that stabilized the upper body. The head moved in slight, predictable oscillations, creating a consistent visual frame for detecting changes on the ground. Skilled trackers often adjust their stride to match terrain, slowing in sandy soils where footprints are faint, quickening in firmer ground where tracks are clearer. This synergy between gait and vision formed an embodied form of cognition. The world was not analysed from a distance but read through motion. Memory played an equally profound role. To follow a trail for hours, sometimes days, required remembering the shape of each clue, the direction of each turn, and the subtle changes in soil or vegetation. But memory and tracking is not a rigid archive. It is dynamic, constantly updated as new information appears. Hunter-gatherers describe this as carrying the track in the mind. The brain constructs a mental image of the animal's path and continually adjusts it, comparing expectation with observation. If a track disappears on hard ground or rocky terrain, memory fills the gap until a new sign appears. In this sense, tracking is a dialogue between perception and recollection, a constant negotiation between what is seen and what is known. Sound also played an essential role. In forests, trackers listened for faint rustles that revealed recent movement. A branch snapped under weight, a pebble disturbed, wings beating in sudden flight. In deserts, sound travelled farther. The crunch of hooves on dry crust or the flutter of startled birds could reveal direction long after the animal had moved on. Early humans developed an ear for distances we rarely perceive today. The Doppler-like shift in sound as herds moved across plains created subtle acoustic clues about location and speed. Even the silence mattered. Trackers often describe the moment when the world becomes too quiet, a sign that animals have sensed danger or changed their behaviour. Footstep silence was another crucial component of tracking skill. Skilled trackers learned to move quietly, not simply for stealth, but because noise masked the environmental sounds they needed to hear. This required careful control of foot placement, weight distribution, and stride length. Gait became adaptive, longer strides over soft ground, shorter ones over brittle vegetation, side steps along angled surfaces to avoid sliding. These adjustments were not taught through instruction, but absorbed through imitation. Children growing up in tracking cultures learn to walk in ways that minimize sound, conserve energy, and maximize sensory input. Their relationship with the ground is intimate. Each surface texture is understood through both vision and the soles of their feet. Ethnographic accounts from desert trackers, such as the Ju Huansi San in southern Africa, reveal a level of detail that borders on astonishing. A tracker might read the depth of a footprint to determine the animal's speed, the slight tilt of a toe impression to infer a change in direction, or the moisture at the base of a track to estimate when it was made. They can identify the age, sex, and even emotional state of animals from the shape of the prints. Their knowledge is not mystical, it is empirical, based on tens of thousands of observations accumulated over lifetimes of walking. For them, tracking is both practical and intellectual, requiring constant attention, intuition built on evidence, and an understanding of ecosystems that is almost encyclopedic. In forested environments, tracking demanded different sensory skills. Rain and humidity altered tracks quickly, so trackers relied more on broken twigs, displaced leaves, and changes in bird calls. A sudden burst of alarm calls from small birds could signal the presence of a predator or large animal moving through understory vegetation. Leaves bruised by hooves or feet released faint scents detectable to those accustomed to the forest's olfactory landscape. Humidity also changed sound. A snapped twig might echo differently under a closed canopy, giving clues to direction. In these environments, visual flow was less important than auditory scanning, and memory had to incorporate three-dimensional mental maps of vegetation structure. The cognitive load of tracking was immense. Early humans had to maintain awareness of current location, the broader landscape, the position of the animal, the behavior of other predators, the availability of water, and the risks of sudden environmental changes. This required working memory, long-term memory, and spatial imagination operating simultaneously, all while walking for hours. Tracking was not simply physical endurance, it was cognitive endurance. The brain became as much a tool for survival as the body. One of the most intriguing aspects of this skill is the role of prediction. Trackers often describe moments when they know where the animal will go next, even without clear tracks. This predictive ability arises from deep familiarity with animal behavior, terrain, and environmental conditions. It is akin to a form of ecological intuition built from years of observation. But scientifically, it reflects high-level pattern recognition. The brain detects correlations between terrain features and animal behavior, forming a probabilistic model long before humans developed formal reasoning. In essence, early humans learned to think in terms of likelihoods, expectations, and contingencies. This is the foundation of planning and strategic thinking. Tracking also cultivated patience. Unlike ambush hunting or sudden pursuit, following a trail requires sustained attention without immediate reward. Hours may pass without seeing the animal. Conditions may obscure tracks. The mind must stay engaged, resisting the urge to abandon the trail or become careless. This patience shaped cognitive discipline that later supported more complex tasks such as crafting tools, organizing group hunts, or maintaining social cohesion. The mental stamina forged on these long walks became part of the cognitive architecture of our species. As the world shifted during the final millennia of the Pleistocene, landscapes changed rapidly. Ice retreated, forests expanded and contracted, coasts moved. Animals altered their migration routes. Tracking skills allowed early humans to adapt to these changes with remarkable resilience. When herds shifted northward as climates warmed, humans followed. When prey moved into denser forests, humans adjusted their sensory strategies. The brain, already shaped by thousands of generations of tracking, proved flexible enough to handle entirely new environments. By the end of this era, around 10,000 years ago, humans had dispersed across nearly every major landmass. But the cognitive foundations that supported this global expansion were ancient, rooted in the simple yet profound act of following tracks. The world was seen not as a static backdrop, but as a living field of information. Every detail mattered. Every footprint was a clue. Every shift in vegetation was a message waiting to be interpreted. Looking back, it becomes clear that the quiet skill of following tracks was one of the earliest forms of scientific observation. It required hypothesis, testing, revision, prediction, and evidence, long before these concepts were formalized. The mind evolved not just to survive, but to understand. And that understanding began with walking through a world where nothing was random and everything left a trace. The camp behind you is safe, warm, and familiar. Food is plentiful. Water is close. The land holds no threat you have not already solved. And yet, as the evening light stretches across the plain, a few people begin to walk toward the horizon. There is no emergency, no famine, no war. They walk because something in the world pulls them forward, or perhaps because something in themselves refuses to stay still. By the time the next generation is born, the old homeland lies far behind, and 1,000 years later, the descendants of those wanderers will stand on shores no ancestor had ever seen, beneath constellations that once lived only in imagination. The first great human journeys did not begin with desperation. They began with possibility. Between roughly 70,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, our species undertook one of the most extraordinary expansions in the natural world. From a starting point in Africa, humans dispersed across Arabia, Asia, Australia, Europe, and eventually the far edges of Ice Age continents. This was not a single migration, nor a unified wave, but a long sequence of movements shaped by climate, curiosity, opportunity, and the quiet confidence of a species built to travel. The traces of those journeys survive today in genetic lineages, archaeological sites, and the footprints our ancestors left in caves and sands across the world. To understand how humans became a global species, we must imagine what it meant to walk across continents that were not yet mapped, not yet divided, not yet known. the first crucial doorway lay in northeastern Africa, where changing climates created temporary windows of opportunity. During wetter intervals, the Sahara transformed from a desert into a mosaic of lakes, grasslands, and river systems. These green Sahara phases opened corridors northward and eastward, enabling humans to move across regions that would later become uninhabitable fossil lake beds, ancient river channels, and traces of stone tools show that humans repeatedly explored this shifting landscape. When humidity waned and deserts returned, groups contracted into refuges, but some continued eastward, reaching the coasts of the Red Sea. From there, the Arabian Peninsula beckoned. Far from being an empty desert as it is today, Arabia during certain climatic windows was rich with grasslands, freshwater springs, and large mammals. Stone tools and ancient hearths discovered across the peninsula reveal that humans moved through these landscapes far earlier and more frequently than once believed. Genetic data suggests that small populations crossed from Africa into Arabia roughly 70,000 years ago. Though earlier forays may have occurred during previous climatic pulses, these movements did not require dramatic cultural revolutions. They required what humans already possessed: mobility, tracking skill, and the ability to adapt to new ecological puzzles. As these early groups expanded along coastal habitats, they encountered fertile shorelines rich in shellfish, fish, and mangrove resources. For tens of thousands of years, coastlines served as natural highways. Walking along them provided stable access to food and predictable navigation. Archaeological sites along the Indian Ocean rim, stretching from the Horn of Africa to southern Arabia to India, show consistent patterns of occupation, suggesting a gradual but steady movement eastward. This great coastal arc may have set the stage for one of humanity's most remarkable journeys, the crossing into Southeast Asia and eventually the arrival in Australia. Reaching Australia required more than endurance. It required open water crossings. Although sea levels were lower during Ice Age intervals, exposing the landmass of Sunda, today's Southeast Asia, deep channels still separated these lands from Sahel, the ancient joined continent of Australia and New Severn Guinea. Yet sometime around 60,000 years ago, humans crossed these waters. Whether they used simple rafts, dugout canoes, or opportunistic drift across narrow straits, the feat demonstrates planning, cooperation, and a willingness to explore beyond visible horizons. Once in Australia, humans adapted rapidly to a continent filled with unfamiliar animals, harsh deserts, and fire-prone ecosystems. The archaeological record shows early mastery of fire management, long-distance travel, and extensive knowledge of the land. These skills were continuations of the mobility traditions honed in Africa, applied to a radically new environment. While some humans moved along coastlines, others ventured deep into the heart of Eurasia. The interior routes through the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Iranian plateau offered rich hunting grounds and seasonal water sources. Genetic data shows that human groups diverged and spread along these corridors, adapting to steppe, woodland, and highland environments. In Central Asia, they encountered colder climates and vast open plains where large Ice Age mammals roamed. The skills of endurance, tracking, and long-distance walking, developed over hundreds of thousands of years, now became essential to survival in these expansive landscapes. Europe presented a different challenge. As humans entered the continent around 45,000 years ago, they encountered Ice Age climates that changed dramatically over short periods. Glacial winds scoured the plains, forests expanded and contracted with shifting temperatures, rivers froze and thawed in unpredictable rhythms, yet humans adapted, exploring valleys carved by ice, hunting reindeer and horse herds across the tundra steppes, and building shelters in caves that preserve their movements in paintings and artifacts. The famous Upper Paleolithic cultures of Europe, Aurignacian, Gravettian, Solutrean, represent not a single unified tradition, but a mosaic of adaptive strategies shaped by mobility and ecological knowledge. Throughout these expansions, genetics offers clues to the pathways humans took. Mitochondrial lineages trace maternal ancestry out of Africa, branching into diverse clusters across Eurasia and Oceania. Y chromosome evidence reveals patterns of male dispersal and population bottlenecks. Genetic diversity remains highest in Africa, reflecting deep ancestral roots, while populations further from Africa show signs of founder effects, where small migrating groups seeded new regions. These patterns align with the archaeological record: repeated dispersals, small groups exploring new lands, and long periods of relative isolation in different ecological regions. But the story of these journeys is not only biological, it is cultural. For tens of thousands of years, movement itself became a defining feature of human life, walking-shaped identity. Groups carried knowledge across continents: how to track animals, how to find water in harsh landscapes, how to navigate by stars or landforms, how to interpret seasonal cycles. These skills were taught to children not in schools but through participation, walking behind elders, observing signs on the ground, learning the rhythms of migration routes. Over generations, these journeys accumulated into cultural traditions, creating networks of knowledge that stretched across vast territories. Importantly, many migrations were not one way. Seasonal movement became a regular pattern in several regions. In Ice Age Europe, groups followed reindeer herds across hundreds of kilometers. In Siberia, humans adapted to frozen rivers and permafrost, traveling along them during winter when snow hardened into navigable paths. In Southeast Asia, groups moved through dense forests, coastal zones, and river systems depending on monsoon cycles. The landscape itself became a calendar, and walking became the means by which humans read it. Some of the most striking evidence for the scale of ancient mobility comes not from stones or bones, but from stories encoded in early mythologies and oral traditions. In Australia, for example, songlines, pathways encoded in songs, trace routes across thousands of kilometres, linking waterholes, mountains, and sacred sites. These paths are both maps and memories, preserving environmental knowledge accumulated over countless generations. While the specific mythologies are much younger than the earliest migrations, their existence hints at an ancient tradition of embedding geography into culture, creating a cognitive landscape where walking and memory were inseparable. Across the globe, by the time 10,000 years ago arrived, humans had reached every major landmass except Antarctica. They had adapted to deserts, rainforests, highlands, and tundras. They had crossed open water, traversed mountain ranges, and survived climatic extremes. But perhaps the most telling aspect of these journeys is that they were undertaken not simply out of necessity, but out of capacity. Humans had become a species that could move farther, faster, and more intelligently than any other primate. They transformed the planet not through force, but through footsteps. The great journeys also reshaped human diversity. Isolated populations developed distinct languages, tool traditions, artistic styles, and genetic patterns. Yet the underlying rhythm of mobility remained. People continued to walk long distances for trade, for marriage alliances, for seasonal hunts, for ritual gatherings. Even when agriculture later encouraged settlement, many communities maintained elements of their ancient mobility through pastoralism or seasonal movement. The imprint of those early journeys never fully faded. Looking across these 70,000 years, the sheer scale of human dispersal becomes almost overwhelming. But when we return to the individual level, the story becomes intimate again. Every long migration began with a single decision to take a step beyond the known horizon. Each step revealed a little more of the world. Each discovery created new reasons to continue. And over generations, those steps carried our species across oceans, mountains, deserts, and ice fields, stitching together a global tapestry of human presence. And perhaps the quiet question left at the end of all this is not why humans left places where they had everything they needed, but why staying still never became our default. From the earliest footprints in African mud to the first tracks on Australian soil, mobility was not just a strategy of survival. It was an expression of what it meant to be human. Our ancestors walked because walking made the world larger, and in making the world larger it made us who we are. Imagine this. You begin to walk not with any goal in mind, not toward a place or a task, but simply because something inside you feels crowded. The moment your feet fall into rhythm, thoughts that were tangled begin to loosen. A memory you could not face while sitting quietly becomes softer at the edges. Ideas that refuse to move suddenly find a path forward. It feels as if the entire body is thinking, as if every step clears a little more space in the mind. And perhaps the strange part is not that walking changes how we think, but that we ever imagined thinking could happen without movement at all. For most of our species' existence, the brain and the body moved as one. Thought emerged in motion, shaped by landscapes that demanded constant awareness. We tracked animals by reading faint traces in sand and soil. We evaluated paths, scents, shadows, and the angle of the wind. We remembered where waterholes lay miles apart. We predicted storms by the way light changed on distant horizons. Walking was not a separate activity. It was the framework within which attention, memory, and emotion formed their earliest alliances. Today, even though the world has shifted, the architecture of that ancient alliance remains inside us, and cognitive science is only beginning to understand how deep that architecture runs. One of the most revealing discoveries of the past few decades concerns the default mode network, the system of brain regions that becomes active when the mind drifts inward. This network generates much of our internal dialogue: memory recall, self-reflection, planning for the future. It is active when our eyes are open but unfocused, when imagination flows without direction. Strangely, the default mode network does not calm down when we sit still. It often becomes noisy, busy, almost overactive. Yet during steady rhythmic walking, its activity changes. The network becomes more synchronized, more stable, and less burdened by emotional turbulence. Neuroscientists describe this state as a kind of internal alignment, though none are quite sure why simple movement brings such harmony. Part of the answer may lie in the bilateral rhythm itself. Every step alternates the activation of the left and right hemispheres of the brain. This alternating pattern resembles what therapists observe during bilateral stimulation, a technique used to help people process traumatic memories. In controlled studies, rhythmic left-right motion allows the brain to revisit emotionally difficult experiences without being overwhelmed by them. The emotional weight remains, but the sharpness softens. The memory becomes something the mind can hold without collapsing under it. Walking, without anyone instructing us, generates the same neurological pattern. Left foot, right foot, left foot. A gentle rocking of the hemispheres that quiets emotional reactivity and encourages integration. If this sounds abstract, consider what it feels like when a memory catches in the chest, when something unresolved sits just out of reach. Sitting still often makes it sharper, but walking shifts the experience. The memory seems to travel with the body rather than pressing inward. Some people describe it as thinking with momentum. Others feel as if the body pulls the memory through an unseen filter, letting only what they can handle rise to consciousness. Scientists cannot yet map this process fully, but studies of anxiety show that rhythmic walking reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, while increasing connectivity between memory regions. The body moves and emotion follows at a safer distance. Another clue comes from creativity research. In experiments where people are asked to generate new ideas, those who walk produce more original solutions than those who sit. The quality of ideas improves too, becoming more flexible and imaginative. This does not happen during intense physical exercise, only during steady rhythmic movement that leaves mental resources free. Researchers believe this shift occurs because walking transitions the brain into a soft focus mode, something between directed attention and dreamlike wandering. This liminal state appears to be ideal for connecting distant concepts or reinterpreting problems in new ways. It mirrors the mindset our ancestors needed when scanning landscapes for patterns. Not too focused, not too relaxed, ready to catch signals from the world or from memory. Yet the emotional science of walking becomes clearest when researchers study how the brain handles unresolved experiences. In certain therapies, individuals are asked to recall stressful or traumatic events while engaging in bilateral movement. The motion does not erase the memory, nor does it hide it. Instead, it helps the brain recode it, placing it into narrative form rather than raw sensory form. Memories that once arrived as flashbacks or intrusive images begin to feel like events that belong to the past, not threats in the present. Walking can produce a similar effect in everyday life. When something is too heavy to hold still, movement creates distance, and in that distance the memory becomes articulate. There is also the strange phenomenon of motoric scaffolding, the idea that the body provides a physical structure that supports cognitive load. When we walk, proprioceptive signals from muscles and joints constantly stream into the brain, providing a stable sense of orientation. This sensory stability frees cognitive resources that would otherwise be spent on maintaining internal balance. As a result, the brain can allocate more energy to reflection and emotional processing. Walking becomes not a distraction from thinking, but the condition that allows deeper thinking to occur. Even the eyes contribute. As we walk, our visual field moves backward in a smooth pattern. This optic flow creates a predictable rhythm that reduces neural noise. It is similar to the calming effect of watching waves, drifting clouds, or grass moving in wind. But unlike passive viewing, walking involves synchronized motion of eyes, limbs, and breath. This synchronization creates what some researchers call a global neural rhythm, a gentle unifying beat that quiets internal chaos. The brain, in a sense, hums with the body, and yet the most compelling part of this story may be the simplest. Memory evolved in beings who walked. For millions of years, the ability to remember mattered most while moving through space. Where was the last water source? Which direction did the herd travel? Where did danger wait? Memory was not an archive, but a living map. Emotion, too, evolved for movement. Fear to freeze us or push us forward, curiosity to draw us toward possibility, attachment to keep groups intact during long migrations. These systems were never meant to operate in stillness. They were built for a world where understanding required motion. So when walking helps us recall something long forgotten, or loosens a memory that felt stuck, or opens a path to an idea we did not know we carried, perhaps it is not because walking is therapeutic in a modern sense. Perhaps it is because walking returns the brain to its oldest environment, a place where thought and movement were inseparable. The body remembers something the modern world forgets, that clarity often waits just beyond the next step. In the end, walking does not teach us anything new about being human. It simply reveals what the body has known for millions of years, that the mind is not confined to the skull, that memory is not trapped in stillness, and that sometimes, to understand our own lives, we must move through them. Imagine this. You step beneath a canopy of leaves, and your entire nervous system exhales before you do. Nothing dramatic happens. No revelation, no achievement, just the soft dimming of light, the slow shift of air, the quiet presence of living things that neither demand nor judge. Within minutes, your pulse steadies, your breath deepens. A calmness rises that feels older than thought, older than language, older even than the forests themselves. It is as if some buried part of the human mind recognizes this place, not as scenery but as home. And perhaps the real mystery is not why nature soothes us, but why we ever expected to live without it. When we look at the deep history of our species, the overwhelming majority of our time on Earth unfolded in landscapes where trees, grasses, rocks and water were not distant retreats but the architecture of daily life. Human cognition developed among branching limbs, shifting shadows, and patterns of light filtered through leaves. Our sensory systems, emotional responses, and even our stress physiology evolved under conditions where nature was not an escape, but the world itself. So when we step into a forest path today, the calm we feel may not be a modern preference. It may be the brain recognizing familiar geometry. Scientists use the word biophilia to describe this instinctive attraction to living systems. The term refers not to sentimental love of nature, but to the deep neurological affinity the human mind has for organic forms, branching trees, flowing water, curved leaves, the rhythmic movement of light through foliage. Studies show that these patterns trigger the parasympathetic nervous system, the biological machinery responsible for rest, digestion, recovery, and even emotional equilibrium. When we encounter environments that match the ancestral conditions in which this system evolved, it responds as it once did, by reducing stress hormones, lowering heart rate, and restoring attention. But the effect goes deeper than relaxation. Our visual system is incredibly sensitive to fractal geometry, the repeating patterns found throughout nature. Fractals appear in tree branches, river networks, cloud formations, the veins of leaves, the structure of mountains, and even the microscopic architecture of lung tissue. The human brain recognizes these patterns instinctively. They fall into what scientists call a processing sweet spot, meaning the brain can interpret them with minimal effort. This ease of processing creates a sense of ease within the mind itself. It is not conscious perception but neurological efficiency. The world becomes easier to see, and so the mind becomes easier to inhabit. Urban environments rarely provide this kind of input. Straight lines, sharp angles, and uniform surfaces require more cognitive work to interpret. They are not harmful on their own, but they are unfamiliar to a brain that spent hundreds of thousands of years navigating irregular, textured, non-repeating landscapes. A forest path, by contrast, offers complexity without chaos. The patterns are rich but predictable. The eye has countless places to rest. There is also the chemistry of the forest itself. Trees emit airborne organic compounds called phytoncides, part of their natural immune system. When humans breathe these compounds, subtle shifts occur in our own physiology. Studies show increased activity of natural killer cells, reduced inflammation markers, and improved autonomic balance. In other words, the forest is not just visually soothing, it communicates chemically with the human body, engaging systems far older than civilization. For most of human history, our immune responses calibrated themselves through constant exposure to these environments. The quiet health effect many people feel among trees may be the body remembering a conversation it once held with the natural world. Beyond chemistry and pattern recognition lies something even more primal, the sensory world that shaped early human survival. In a forest, sound behaves differently. Noise softens. High-frequency sounds are absorbed by leaves and branches. Low-frequency sounds travel farther. The ear does not simply relax. It reverts to the patterns it evolved to monitor. A rustle in the underbrush becomes a signal. Wind through the canopy becomes a backdrop. Bird calls create a map of nearby life. Modern environments saturate the senses with artificial signals that carry no evolutionary meaning. Forests offer signals that do. Walking through such an environment engages multiple systems at once. Vision interpreting fractals, lungs absorbing phytoncides, ears filtering layered sound, skin feeling micro changes in temperature and humidity. The cumulative effect is not only soothing but integrating. Sensory systems that operate separately in artificial environments begin to harmonize in natural ones. Some researchers call this neural coherence, a state in which brain regions synchronize into more stable rhythms. This coherence resembles patterns seen in meditation, in deep rest, and even in early developmental bonding. When people describe nature as grounding, the word may be more literal than metaphorical. Perhaps this integration occurs because the landscapes we evolved in demanded a particular balance of attention, soft focus with alertness, relaxation with readiness. In forests and woodlands, humans needed to interpret faint sounds, recognize edible plants, evaluate shelter, and track the movement of animals. Too much focus created tunnel vision. Too little created danger. The environment encouraged a precise middle state. Walking in nature today may recreate that state, tuning the brain to a bandwidth where it feels both calm and aware. This blend of alertness and ease is rare in modern life, where attention is pulled sharply among tasks, screens, and demands. Nature does not require this fragmentation. It allows the mind to hold steady. Another layer of calm emerges from the way natural environments modulate time. In forests, time does not rush in straight lines. It expands and softens. Light filters differently. Shadows drift with subtlety. The pace of change is slow enough to watch, but fast enough to remind the mind of movement. This temporal rhythm mirrors the internal rhythms of the human body: heartbeat, breath, walking gait. When external environment and internal state align, the nervous system relaxes. Our ancestors, who depended on ready changes in light, weather, and vegetation, likely evolved cognitive systems that settle when the outside world signals safety through slowness. Even the smell of earth, rich with microbes that shaped early immune systems, produces measurable changes in mood regulation. Soil contains bacteria that influence serotonin pathways, possibly because humans evolved in constant contact with such organisms. When people describe the scent of wet soil as comforting or grounding, they may be interpreting a biochemical memory. The body recalls environments that once supported survival. And yet the power of nature to calm the mind is not only chemical, geometric, or evolutionary. It is also relational. When we step into a forest, we enter a world where our presence is not central. Trees do not respond to us. Water does not bend to our will. The wind does not adjust itself to human concerns. This lack of demand frees mental resources. attention shifts from internal preoccupation to external observation. For a mind accustomed to constant self-referential processing, this shift can feel like relief. The world becomes larger, and in doing so it allows the self to feel smaller, not diminished, but unburdened. Perhaps the most striking part of nature's effect on the mind is how little effort it requires. The nervous system knows what to do long before conscious thought intervenes. A forest is not a therapist, and a walk among trees does not solve the complexities of modern existence, but it does provide conditions under which the mind can rest without shutting down, reflect without spiraling, and remember without distress. It brings us into alignment with the sensory and cognitive world that shaped our species. In the end, the calming effect of nature is not a mystery at all, it is a return. The brain recognizes environments that resemble the ones in which it learned to regulate itself. The body responds to signals it has trusted for tens of thousands of generations, and the mind settles into rhythms older than civilization, older even than the stories we tell about why we seek quiet places. Perhaps the deeper truth is that nature does not reset the brain. It reminds the brain of its original settings. You are walking along a quiet path, and without thinking, your hand reaches toward the ground. A fallen branch catches your eye. It fits the palm easily. Light, but not fragile. Straight, but not perfect. You lift it, tap it once against the earth, and suddenly your posture changes. Your steps feel more certain, your stride lengthens. The world seems a little more navigable. Nothing magical happens, yet something ancient stirs. You didn't need the stick, and yet your body welcomed it as if remembering a forgotten habit. And the subtle truth is this: for as long as humans have walked upright, we have reached for something to carry in the hand. When archaeologists examine early human sites across Africa and Eurasia, they often find stone tools, bone fragments, hearths, and the remains of hunted animals. What they rarely find are the wooden objects that once filled human lives. Wood decays too easily. It leaves almost nothing behind unless preserved in exceptional conditions like deep caves, frozen soils, or waterlogged sediments. And yet the few surviving examples tell a clear story humans have been crafting and carrying sticks for hundreds of thousands of years. Digging sticks, probing sticks, sharpened spears, fire carriers, throwing shafts. These objects were not accessories. They were extensions of the body, tools that shaped how humans moved through the world. As time passed and our species spread across continents, the relationship between humans and handheld sticks evolved. Some became weapons, some became tools for gathering food, some became symbols of authority or ritual, but one of the most persistent uses remained the simplest. People carried sticks to help them walk. This instinct appears across cultures and centuries. Pilgrims travelling to distant shrines used long staffs carved with simple patterns. Shepherds guiding flocks across rugged hills leaned on stout poles. Travellers crossed mountains and forests with walking sticks that steadied their gait on uneven ground. Even in societies that developed advanced metallurgy, the wooden staff remained a quiet companion. Why? Part of the answer lies in biomechanics. When a walking human applies even a small amount of downward pressure on a stick, the centre of mass shifts. Weight distributes more evenly across muscles and joints. The stick acts as a counterbalance, reducing load on the knees and ankles and providing additional points of stability. On rough terrain, this additional stabilization makes movement more efficient and less risky. Even a simple cane reduces compressive forces on joints by absorbing part of the impact that would normally travel through the legs. For elderly walkers, this effect can mean the difference between confidence and caution. For shepherds climbing steep slopes, it can mean the difference between safe passage and a fall. But the biomechanical value of handheld sticks is only one part of the story. There is also a cognitive dimension. When the hand engages with a tool, the brain's motor systems activate differently neural circuits for balance, perception, and rhythm adjust. The act of holding a stick anchors the body in space, giving feedback that helps coordinate complex movements. Some neuroscientists describe this phenomenon as extended proprioception, meaning the body senses the environment not only through feet and legs, but through the tool as well. The stick becomes an additional limb in the mind's internal map. The world feels closer, more stable, more readable. In many cultures, staffs and canes acquired symbolic meaning that reflected their practical value. In ancient Egypt, high officials carried long curved staffs as signs of authority. In parts of Mesopotamia, rulers were depicted with shepherd's crooks, invoking the image of a leader who guides and protects. In Greece, travellers carried long walking sticks called baklases during long journeys across rocky terrain. In medieval Europe, pilgrims set out on foot carrying tall wooden staffs, often marked with notches or tokens from the places they had visited. These staffs served practical functions: support on steep roads, defence against animals, but also spiritual ones. They marked the walker as someone on a purposeful journey. In East Asia, the walking staff appears in martial arts traditions, religious pilgrimages, and rural life. In Japan, mountain ascetics carried tall wooden poles during their steep climbs, partly for balance but also for ritual protection. In China, travelling scholars and wandering monks often depicted themselves with walking sticks that symbolised humility, endurance, and clarity of mind. Across these cultures, the staff is more than a tool. It is a companion that embodies movement through time and landscape. The modern world did not erase this instinct. Instead, it refined it. With the rise of mountaineering and long-distance hiking in the 19th and 20th centuries, walking sticks evolved into specialised tools: alpenstocks, cane poles, and eventually carbon fibre trekking poles. These modern versions apply the same biomechanics our ancestors once exploited: load reduction, stability, and energy conservation. Laboratory studies show that trekking poles can reduce impact forces on the knees by a significant percentage and shift work from the lower body to the upper body in a way that reduces fatigue. None of these innovations change the fundamental principle. Humans walk better with something held in the hand. Even outside of outdoor recreation, the cultural presence of walking sticks persists. Characters across literature and history carry them, not as fashion statements, but as extensions of personality. The dignified stride of a statesman with a cane, the relaxed confidence of a wanderer with a staff, the image of a detective, calm, perceptive, always thinking, resting a hand on a cane during long contemplative walks. These images endure because they resonate with something older than storytelling. They depict humans in motion with tools that steady the body and perhaps the mind. What is striking is that the instinct appears even in children. Hand a child a stick during a walk and they will use it instantly. Tapping the ground, pushing leaves aside, dragging it across the dirt, testing balance on stones. No instruction is needed. The behaviour emerges spontaneously, as if the relationship between walking and carrying a stick is wired into the deep structure of human motor development. Children explore the world through touch and movement, and the stick becomes an extension of curiosity. When anthropologists examine societies where walking remains a primary mode of travel, they often note the ubiquity of handheld supports. In pastoral communities across Africa and Central Asia, herders regularly move through uneven terrain using wooden staffs cut from local trees. These objects assist with balance on steep slopes, help assess the ground's firmness, and serve as resting supports during long periods of standing. Among forest hunter-gatherers, shorter sticks assist with probing soil, clearing brush, and testing water depth. Again, these sticks are not luxury items or signs of status. They are the simplest, most versatile tools a walker can carry. And yet, handheld sticks also play a role in pacing. When walkers tap the ground rhythmically, they create a metronome of sorts, a steady beat that helps regulate breathing and stride. This rhythmic reinforcement reduces variability in gait, conserving energy and improving overall efficiency. Studies on walking rhythm have shown that this kind of external cueing helps stabilize cadence, particularly on uneven surfaces. In ancient times, when humans walked across shifting landscapes filled with obstacles, this subtle rhythmic aid would have been invaluable. Throughout history, even as societies urbanized, canes and staffs persisted as personal instruments of navigation. In crowded cities, canes signalled presence, created personal space, and helped maintain balance on uneven cobblestones. Some canes were hollowed to store maps or notes, others concealed small tools. In the 18th and 19th centuries, fashionable canes reflected identity and craftsmanship, but beneath the ornamentation lay the same functional design, a simple wooden device shaped to fit the human hand. Today, even as technology advances, modern walkers and hikers return to this ancient partnership. Trekking poles made of carbon fibre or aluminum continue a lineage that began with the first human to pick up a fallen branch. Their design mirrors ancient principles, light enough to carry without burden, strong enough to bear weight, long enough to shift posture, and simple enough to integrate naturally into movement. The modern world may decorate them with logos or adjustability, but their essence is unchanged. If we step back and look at the long arc of human culture, a pattern emerges. Every generation reinvented the walking stick in its own way. Prehistoric humans carved and sharpened them. Nomads used them as supports for tents. Pastoralists leaned on them as they watched over herds. Pilgrims marked their journeys upon them. Scholars turned them into symbols of wisdom. Explorers used them to measure terrain. Hikers and mountaineers transformed them into engineered tools. Yet all these many forms share the same simple origin: the need for the human body to move confidently across the unpredictable world. In the end, perhaps the reason humans still reach for sticks when they walk is not cultural at all, it is biological. The human body evolved in partnership with handheld tools. The hand, wrist and arm evolved not only to manipulate objects but to stabilize movement. Carrying a stick aligns posture, engages muscles that support the spine, and distributes effort across the body. It provides tactile feedback about the world underfoot. It sharpens awareness by extending the reach of our senses. And it echoes the movements that shaped our species across millions of years. Modern cities, paved sidewalks, and technological conveniences may obscure this heritage, but they do not erase it. The hand still knows what to do when it wraps around a smooth length of wood. The body still shifts into ancient patterns of balance when it taps the ground. And the mind still finds subtle reassurance in the contact between tool and earth. Perhaps, in the quietest moments of a long walk, the stick becomes more than a support. It becomes a reminder that humans have always moved through the world with something held in the hand. A reminder that what seems unnecessary today was once part of survival. And a reminder that even in the age of carbon fibre and concrete skylines, our bodies still carry the memory of simpler tools that guided our steps through deep time. A human begins to run, not in a stadium, not on a measured track, but across an open landscape under a rising sun. There is no finish line. The path is uneven, the air warm, the ground shifting between grass and stone, yet the body settles into a rhythm so stable it almost feels ancestral. Breath, stride, heartbeat, sweat, all aligning in a pattern older than settlement, older than the first stone tool, older even than the idea of sport. The distance ahead is long, but nothing inside the body resists it. Instead, something deep within seems to recognize it, as if this is what we were built for. As if the marathon is not a modern invention at all, but an echo of a pursuit that once shaped the very architecture of the human frame. To understand why the human body can sustain such distance, and why the specific length of a marathon feels strangely natural for many trained runners, we need to return to the conditions that shaped endurance physiology over hundreds of thousands of years. For most mammals, running long distances generates heat faster than their bodies can release it. Quadrupeds, especially large herbivores, rely on panting to cool themselves. Panting works well at slow speeds, but at sustained trot or canter it becomes less effective. Their breathing cycle becomes mechanically tied to their stride, limiting how fast their lungs can cool the body. When heat rises too high, they may stop. Humans evolved a different system. Our species became sweaters, creatures that release heat across almost the entire surface of the skin. The density of our sweat glands, combined with our mostly hairless bodies, allows perspiration to evaporate even at moderate running speeds. This cooling ability is so efficient that humans can continue moving when many animals must pause. And while sprinting is not our strength, maintaining a moderate pace for hours is well within the design of our physiology. This capacity is not assumed, it is measured. Human muscles contain a high proportion of slow-twitch fibers, built for endurance. Our joints, ligaments, and tendons absorb and release energy like biological springs, especially the Achilles tendon, which stores elastic energy during each stride. The gluteus maximus, unusually large for a primate, stabilizes the torso during running. The knuckle ligament keeps the head steady, allowing vision to remain stable during movement. All these features point toward a body engineered not for speed, but for distance. Persistence hunting, a technique used by some traditional societies, takes advantage of this endurance advantage. While we will not revisit its details here, we can observe that the distances covered in such pursuits often fall within the range that modern marathons approximate. Not because humans consciously selected a specific length, but because the physiological limits of the body naturally converge around a similar distance. In the archaeological and ethnographic record, long-distance pursuits frequently cover tens of kilometers, sometimes approaching or exceeding 40 kilometers during extended tracking. This is not coincidence. It is the result of metabolic boundaries set millions of years ago. Modern physiology helps explain why this range feels natural. During steady endurance effort, the human body draws from stored glycogen and fat reserves at a ratio optimized for moderate, sustained work. Glycogen depletion, often referred to metaphorically as hitting the wall, tends to occur around the same distance as a marathon for untrained runners, but trained endurance athletes can shift this threshold through improved fat oxidation and better pacing. This metabolic pattern echoes the requirements of ancient endurance tasks, where conserving energy mattered far more than speed. Even cardiac efficiency reflects this history. The human heart handles sustained, rhythmic exertion with exceptional stability. Stroke volume increases during moderate exercise, allowing the heart to pump more blood with each beat. Over long periods, trained endurance athletes develop a lower resting heart rate, and larger cardiac chambers, features rarely seen in species whose evolution favoured sprinting or short bursts. The cardiovascular adaptations that support a marathon runner today mirror the evolutionary pressures that once supported long hours of steady movement across varied terrain. Another striking detail lies in the structure of our feet. Human feet are not built like the feet of sprinters or climbers. They are built for repetitive impact. The arches act as shock absorbers and energy return mechanisms. The toes, shorter and aligned compared to earlier hominins, reduce the torque required during push-off. The heel, rounded and robust, bears impact while distributing force efficiently. This design is not ideal for explosive acceleration. It is perfect for long-distance travel. Every step is a small negotiation between efficiency and durability, and the human foot performs this negotiation with remarkable skill. Temperature regulation contributes to this endurance capacity in a way few mammals can match. Sweating cools the body so effectively that humans can maintain a relatively stable internal temperature, even in hot environments. Many wild animals, when pursued for long distances, overheat long before exhaustion of muscle. Humans, with their combination of sweating, long legs for stride efficiency, and upright posture, which reduces sun exposure, can continue well past the point where quadrupeds must rest. This capability is crucial for understanding why marathons are possible at all. It is not athleticism alone, it is thermoregulatory design. If the human body seems almost too well suited for marathon-like distances, modern anatomical studies offer further clues. Tendons in the legs, particularly the iliotibial band and Achilles tendon, behave like springs during running. They store kinetic energy when the foot strikes the ground and release it during the push-off phase. This elastic recoil significantly reduces metabolic cost. In comparative studies, humans expend less energy per unit of distance at moderate running speeds than many animals that appear more athletic. We are, in the simplest terms, economical movers. This economy is not accidental. It reflects an evolutionary path that rewarded the ability to travel efficiently across large territories. There is also the role of the vestibular system. Maintaining balance while moving at speed requires sophisticated neural coordination. The human inner ear contains structures that stabilize vision during motion, allowing the brain to process environmental information clearly while running. This stability is essential for assessing terrain, tracking movement, and making decisions at speed. Without it, endurance running across unpredictable ground would be far more dangerous. In this light, the marathon becomes less a modern sporting event and more a symbolic reenactment of an ancient capacity. When a runner begins that long journey, consciously or not, they invoke a pattern of movement that once determined survival. The distance feels familiar because it is embedded in the body's architecture. The fatigue feels meaningful because it echoes challenges that shaped human physiology. The sense of triumph at the finish line resonates because endurance once defined the boundary between life and death, success and starvation. Yet it is important to acknowledge that the marathon itself is not an evolutionary relic. It is a cultural construct layered upon biological heritage. The exact length, over 40 kilometers, was set by historical events in the early 20th century, not by prehistoric necessity. But the fact that humans can complete such a distance at all, and often return to it voluntarily, speaks to a deeper truth. We did not evolve for sprinting, nor for explosive strength, nor for climbing. We evolved to move with persistence, to follow trails that stretch beyond sight, to pursue, to explore, to endure. And perhaps this is why, for many runners, the experience feels almost meditative. There is a point where the body falls into rhythm, where thought drifts into quiet clarity, where the world narrows to breath and stride. This is not a modern psychological phenomenon. It is the reactivation of ancient patterns of movement that once required intense focus, stable emotion, and sustained attention. The runner today mirrors the persistence hunter of prehistory, not in purpose, but in process. The marathon, then, is not a test imposed upon the human body. It is a reminder, a ritualized echo of distances once walked or run not for glory but for survival. And when we cross its threshold, we step not only into a modern athletic challenge, but into a lineage of movement that shaped our bones, our hearts, and our very sense of endurance. Imagine this. You step outside after a difficult day, not expecting anything in particular, and begin to walk. No destination, no pace, no purpose, just movement. The first few steps feel ordinary. Then something shifts. Your breath, tight without you noticing, loosens. The muscles behind your ribs unclench. The noise in your mind, loud only moments ago, begins to fall into a rhythm that matches the sound of your steps. The world around you, which felt sharp and close, softens into distance. And for reasons you cannot explain, you feel a kind of quiet that does not come from thought, but from the body remembering something older than the life you live now. What if this calm is not modern at all? What if it is the oldest memory your species carries? Across our entire evolutionary history, walking shaped nearly every part of the human organism. The skeleton that distributes weight, the heart that learns to beat in long, steady cycles, the brain that maps space in expanding rings of orientation, the senses that interpret shifting landscapes with fluid precision. For millions of years, to be human was to be in motion. Every landscape demanded it. Every survival challenge rewarded it. Memory, emotion, attention, and identity grew inside bodies that were always moving forward through the world. Today, even when we live in apartments and offices and cities that can be crossed in minutes, the deeper architecture remains unchanged. The body still expects movement. The mind still functions best in rhythm, and the quiet relief that arrives during a walk is not a psychological trick. It is an ancient agreement resurfacing modern neuroscience offers gentle confirmation of this. When we walk, the brain's regulatory systems, those that govern stress, emotional balance, and cognitive clarity, begin to align in ways that sitting rarely supports. Regions involved in spatial navigation, self-reflection, and memory retrieval shift into coordinated patterns. Rhythmic movement stabilizes networks that normally fluctuate, breathing synchronizes with stride. The vestibular system, which maintains balance, communicates with the limbic system, which processes emotion. A long, steady walk weaves these signals together until the nervous system feels held rather than scattered. Scientists describe this as regulation, but the experience feels simpler. The self becomes quieter, and the world becomes larger. Part of this effect comes from orientation. For early humans, knowing where you were, relative to water, food, danger, and shelter, was essential. The brain evolved to keep track of direction, distance, and landmarks. Even today, moving through space wakes these systems in ways that screens and static environments do not. When you walk, especially in natural or open environments, the brain updates its internal maps. That mapping process subtly shifts attention away from rumination and toward external cues. The effect is not distraction, it is relief. The mind stops folding inward and begins to unfold outward. Walking also supports memory in ways that cognitive science is only starting to understand. The hippocampus, the region deeply involved in remembering and imagining, activates differently during rhythmic movement. Memory becomes more fluid, more narrative, less fragmented. People often recall events during walks that they avoided or struggled to articulate while sitting still. Something about the pace of movement seems to allow memory to surface without urgency or pressure. The brain returns to the way it once processed experience, in motion, across landscapes, surrounded by cues that anchored emotion to place rather than confinement. This connection between landscape and identity is not a metaphor. For most of human history, your understanding of who you were came from your relationship to the land you travelled. You knew yourself through the distances you crossed, the paths you followed, the places you returned to. Movement shaped story long before writing existed. Even today, many people think best while walking because narrative and motion evolve together. Each step helps shape the next idea. Each corner turned creates a shift in perspective. The body leads, and the mind follows. There is another layer to this calm that emerges during walking, the dissolution of internal noise. When the mind is overwhelmed by tasks, by emotions, by uncertainty, it often spins in tight circles. Walking breaks this loop. The steady rhythm gives intrusive thoughts something to ride on. The visual flow quiets the constant internal rehearsal of problems. Breathing deepens naturally. Muscles release stored tension that the brain interprets as emotional threat. Before long, the mind no longer tries to force solutions. It allows understanding to arise in slower, more organic ways. This is not clarity as achievement. It is clarity as byproduct. The emotional shift that comes during walking is supported by physiological changes as well. Stress hormones decrease. The parasympathetic system, the part of the nervous system responsible for rest and restoration, gains influence. Heart rate variability improves, reflecting better emotional resilience. The internal systems that regulate mood, long suppressed by the fast pace of modern life, recover their natural rhythm. Walking becomes a biological reset, not because it is effortful, but because it returns the body to the conditions in which its regulatory systems evolved. Anthropologists sometimes describe walking as a form of embodied orientation, a way the body negotiates both the outer world and the inner one. When we walk, we navigate not only space, but also time. Thoughts stretch out, emotions settle. The present moment becomes larger and more spacious. In cultures around the world, walking has long served as a means of transition, leaving childhood, beginning a pilgrimage, marking the start of a journey, or letting grief move through the body. These traditions endure not because they are ritualistic, but because walking supports emotional transformation in ways that align with the brain's deepest wiring. Perhaps this is why solitary walks feel especially powerful. When no conversation or distraction competes for attention, the subtle signals of the world become more pronounced. The sound of wind, the pattern of light, the texture of ground underfoot. These signals anchor the senses in the present, leaving less space for anxiety to accumulate. This presence is not the product of discipline, it is the natural state of a body that finally has room to breathe. And yet, the most profound part of walking's effect on the human mind may be its simplicity. Walking requires almost nothing. No equipment, no special skill, no elaborate preparation. The body knows what to do. The mind remembers how to follow. In a world that often complicates wellness, walking remains a quiet reminder that regulation need not be elaborate. It can be as simple as movement. But walking is more than a regulation tool. It is a way of being in the world. It reconnects humans to the concept of scale, to the idea that distances can be experienced rather than compressed, that places have texture, that time can be marked not in hours but in steps. The modern world shrinks experience by speeding it up. Walking restores it by slowing it down. A single hour of movement can make the world feel both larger and gentler. This larger world offers perspective. Problems that felt overwhelming indoors often seem smaller outdoors. Thoughts that felt trapped inside the mind begin to disperse into the landscape. Walking does not solve these problems, but it gives them space to reorder themselves. This reordering is part of what makes walking feel healing. It is not that the walk changes your life, it is that it changes your angle on your life. Look closely and you will notice something else. Walking creates a boundary between the self and the world that is porous rather than rigid. You are part of the environment without losing your individuality. You're alone without being isolated. In that space between solitude and connection, the mind rests. Humans evolved in this liminal space. Modern life rarely grants it. The calm you feel during a walk may therefore be the return of an ancient balance between effort and ease, between attention and reflection, between self and world. It is a balance that the body remembers even if the conscious mind has forgotten. As the world grows increasingly complex, the act of walking remains one of the few experiences unchanged by time. The muscles enact patterns that go back millions of years. The breath follows rhythms older than fire. The senses tune to signals that guided early humans across continents. When we walk, we slip into the oldest form of self-regulation our species ever had, and perhaps this is why a simple walk can feel so profoundly grounding. It is not exercise, it is continuity. In the end, walking is not something humans do, it is something humans are. The body learned to understand the world through movement, and movement shaped the mind that now tries to understand itself. The calm you feel on a quiet walk is not a coincidence, it is a memory, a biological echo of landscapes that shaped our species into what it became. Through every step we return, however briefly, to the world that once held us. In the end, walking is not exercise. It is the last living thread connecting you to the world that made you,